There is something deeply unsettling about the idea of a city that simply disappears. Not a city that falls to conquerors, not a city that burns in a war you can find in a textbook, not a city that slowly empties over generations until the last family finally locks the last door and walks away down a dusty road. No, something far stranger than any of that. Cities that were real. Cities that thousands of human beings built and lived in and raised their children in and buried their dead beneath. Cities that thrived for centuries and left monuments and roads and laws and art behind them, and then simply vanished from the earth as completely as if they had never existed at all. Tonight, we are going to travel to 10 of them. Not all of these cities are completely unknown to history. Some have left faint traces, fragments of language, strange coins, ruins half swallowed by jungle or desert or forest, accounts written by travelers who visited them and then watched the world forget them over the following centuries. What they all share is that their final fate remains genuinely, profoundly, stubbornly unsolved. Archaeologists have dug, historians have argued, explorers have hacked through rainforests and waded through marshes and climbed into mountain passes searching for them, and still, the cities keep their secrets. They remain beyond the full reach of our understanding, which means that tonight, we get to go looking for them together. This is exactly the kind of story that belongs to the slow hours of the night, the kind that unspools best when the lights are low and the world outside has gone quiet, when the mind is just alert enough to follow a thread, but relaxed enough to let the images form on their own. So settle in. Find your most comfortable position. Let the noise of the day drift away, and let us travel back together into the deep past, to the places that time forgot, to the cities that vanished and left the world wondering. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has found their way to this channel. Whether you arrived here tonight searching for something calming to listen to, or whether you have been with me for a while now, following these long journeys into the past, your presence here means everything. This channel exists because of the curiosity of people like you, people who believe that history told slowly and carefully, without rushing, is one of the most beautiful ways to let a restless mind find rest. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, please consider subscribing. It is a small thing, but it genuinely helps this work continue, and I am always curious to know who is listening. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now, let us begin. The first city on our journey tonight is one that almost no one, outside of a narrow circle of scholars, has ever heard of. And yet it may be the most significant lost city in the entire ancient world. Its name, as best as historians can reconstruct it, was Ubar, and for centuries, people who lived in the great empty desert of southern Arabia called it something else entirely. They called it Iram of the Pillars, they called it the City of 1,000 Columns, and they called it, with a mixture of awe and grief that is very old and very human, the Atlantis of the sands. The Arabian Peninsula is one of the harshest environments on the surface of the earth. The Rub al-Khali, which in Arabic means simply the empty quarter, is the largest continuous sand desert in the world. It covers roughly 250,000 square miles of territory across what is now Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. The dunes can rise more than 800 feet. The summer temperatures routinely exceed 170 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface of the sand. There is almost no rainfall. There are no permanent rivers. There are no permanent lakes. There are stretches of this desert where a human being, without supplies, would be dead within a day. And it was into the heart of this desert, according to legend, that one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the ancient world was built. The people who supposedly built Ubar were a tribe called the Akkad. They appear in the Quran, in the Bible, in ancient Mesopotamian records, and in the oral traditions of the Bedouin people who have wandered the Arabian desert for thousands of years. The Akkad were described, in these sources, as a people of extraordinary physical power and ambition. They were builders. They raised towers, they said, that scraped the sky. They constructed a city of such beauty and such wealth that travelers came from every corner of the known world to trade there, to marvel at it, to speak of it in whispered tones around desert campfires, for generations afterward. And then, in the same sources, the Akkad and their city simply vanish. The Quran describes a divine punishment, a howling wind that screamed across the desert for 7 nights and 8 days and erased them from the face of the earth. The Bedouin traditions say something similar. The earth opened up, they say, and swallowed the city whole. For most of history, scholars assume that Ubar was exactly what it appeared to be in these sources, which is to say a myth, a story that desert peoples told to explain the silence of the vast emptiness around them, a moral tale about pride and divine punishment, dressed in the clothes of history. No one seriously believed that there was a real city hidden somewhere beneath the sands of the empty quarter. No one, that is, until a British explorer named Bertram Thomas crossed the Rub al Khali on foot in 1930 and came back with a story that changed everything. Thomas had been guided across the desert by Bedouin companions, and somewhere in what is now Oman, his guide stopped and pointed at the ground. There were ancient roads here, they told him, tracks worn deep into the gravel and the limestone by centuries of camel caravans. The Bedouin called them the Road of Iram, and they said that if you followed them, they led to a city that had sunk into the earth. Thomas could not stop to investigate. He had his crossing to complete. But he wrote about what he had seen, and the story stayed alive in the corners of exploration history for the next 60 years. It was satellite imagery that finally cracked the case open, or at least cracked it part way. In the late 1980s, a team that included the filmmaker Wansel Clapp, the archaeologist Juris Zarins, and several NASA scientists began analyzing radar and satellite photographs of the Arabian Peninsula. What they found was extraordinary. Beneath the surface of the desert, the satellites could detect ancient tracks, pathways worn into the rock by thousands of years of foot and hoof traffic, invisible at ground level but perfectly legible from orbit. The paths converged. They all led toward the same point in what is now the Dhofar region of Oman. In 1992, the team excavated the site where the paths converged and found the remains of a large, circular, walled structure. The walls were thick and had been reinforced multiple times. The site contained frankincense burners and South Arabian pottery from roughly the 1st century BCE through the 4th century CE. There were coins and artifacts from as far away as Rome. The team announced, to considerable media attention, that they had found Ubar. But the story has a dark epilogue. The site they uncovered, which archaeologists now call Shiza, did not look like a vast city of pillars and towers. It looked like a large trading post, an important one certainly, but not the legendary metropolis of ancient texts. And the most striking thing about it was what had happened to it. The site had collapsed, literally, physically collapsed. The entire structure had caved in on itself and fallen into a massive sinkhole. The limestone beneath it had been hollowed out by water over millennia, and at some point, probably sometime in the 4th or 5th century CE, the ground had simply given way. The city had been swallowed by the earth, exactly as the legend said. So was Shisa truly Ubar? Scholars disagree sharply. Some believe that this small fortified trading post is the real foundation of the legend, and that the myth inflated it into something grander over centuries of retelling. Others argue that the real Ubar, the city of 1,000 columns, must still be somewhere out there beneath the sands. That what they found at Shisa was merely a satellite settlement, a way station, and that the heart of the Akkad civilization remains undiscovered beneath some other section of the empty quarter. The desert, after all, is large, almost incomprehensibly large. Satellite imagery has its limits, and the Bedouin who live in that part of the world still say, with great calm, that the city is there, that it went down, not away, that the earth has it, and the earth has not finished with it yet. We do not know who was right. We do not know, definitively, what happened to the Akkad, or to Ubar, or to the civilization that built a city so magnificent that it ended up in 3 of the world's major religious texts, as the symbol of human ambition punished by divine power. What we know is that somewhere in the largest empty space in Arabia, the ground holds something, and the old roads still run beneath the sand, pointing toward whatever it is, patient as the desert itself. The second city, takes us in a completely different direction, both geographically and in terms of the mystery it presents. It does not ask us to peer into the sand. It asks us to look up into the mountains and then to stand on a high green ridge in what is now Western Ecuador and ask ourselves how, exactly, a city that 20,000 people called home could simply stop being there and leave almost nothing behind. The city is called Guapondeleg, or rather, that is what the Canary people who built it called it, which translates, in their language, to something like plain as wide as the sky, or the plain where the clouds rest, depending on which linguistic scholar you ask. The Canary were one of the great pre-Columbian civilizations of South America. They had been present in what is now the Ecuadorian highlands for centuries before the Incas arrived, and they had built something that the Incas, when they finally came, recognized immediately as significant. Guapondeleg was a major city, a regional capital. It controlled trade routes through the Andes. It was a center of weaving, of metalwork, of agriculture, of ceremonial life. And when the Inca emperor Tupac Yupanqui conquered the Canary around 1460 CE, he did something that the Incas almost always did when they found a city worth keeping. He did not destroy it. He renamed it. He called it Tomebamba, which in Quechua means plain of knives, a reference to the copper weapons and tools that the Canary were famous for producing. And then he built it bigger. This is the part of the story that makes Guapondeleg, now known in its Inca incarnation as Tomebamba, so deeply tantalizing, because the Incas did not just occupy the city, they transformed it into one of the most important places in the entire Inca Empire. Archaeological and historical sources describe Tomebamba as one of the 4 great royal cities of the Inca world, alongside Cusco itself. There was a great temple to the sun here, a building described by early Spanish chroniclers as being sheathed in gold, literally covered in gold panels that caught the Andean light and burned with it in the thin mountain air. There were palaces, administrative centers, warehouses filled with the tribute of entire conquered nations. There were akloasis, houses of the chosen women, who were dedicated to the service of the Inca state and its gods. Spanish soldiers who rode through the Andes in the 1530s stopped at the ruins of what had been Tomebamba and described, with undisguised awe, a city that was clearly extraordinary even in its shattered state. Because here is what happened to Tomebamba. In the years just before the Spanish arrived, the Inca Empire tore itself apart in a civil war. 2 brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, fought for the throne of their dead father, and Tomebamba, which had been a stronghold for Atahualpa's faction, was attacked and largely destroyed by Huáscar's forces around 1530. Then the Spanish arrived, and then the colonial city of Cuenca was built by the Spanish, directly on top of the ruins of Tomebamba, which now sits directly on top of the ruins of Guapondeleg. 3 cities, one on top of another, the oldest and most mysterious one at the very bottom, now buried under a modern Ecuadorian city of nearly 700,000 people. Excavations beneath Cuenca have revealed fragments of what was there. Archaeologists have found walls, platforms, terraces, the foundations of what appear to be enormous buildings. They have found Inca pottery and Canary pottery, and beneath that, traces of something older still. But the modern city makes comprehensive excavation almost impossible. You cannot simply dig up Cuenca to find Guapondeleg. The living has to go on. The ancient has to wait. What we are left with then is a ghost beneath a ghost beneath a ghost. The Canary city that was so impressive the Incas made it one of their capitals. The Inca capital that was so magnificent that Spanish soldiers stopped on their march of conquest to write about it with something approaching reverence. And the colonial city that was built on top of both of them and is still there, still alive, still full of people who walk over the deep past every single day without being able to see it. We have fragments. We have chronicles. We have the occasional wall uncovered during a construction project. But the full shape of Guapondeleg, the plain as wide as the sky, the city that was old when the Incas found it, that city is still largely lost to us, buried under centuries and cities, patient in the Andean earth. The third city on our journey tonight takes us to the deep forests of Central Asia, to a region that has been so consistently at the crossroads of empires and so consistently ravaged by war, drought, political upheaval, and simple geographical remoteness that it is genuinely surprising any of its ancient past has survived at all. The city we are looking for tonight is called Mer, or sometimes Merv, and while it is technically not entirely lost, what is lost about it is so staggering in scale that it deserves a place on any list of vanished cities. Merv was once the largest city on Earth, not the largest city in Central Asia, not the largest city in the Islamic world, though it held both those titles at various points. The largest city on Earth, full stop. At its peak, in the 12th century CE, scholars estimate that somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people lived in and around Merv, making it comparable to contemporary Song dynasty, China's greatest metropoles, and far larger than anything in Europe at the time. It sat at the heart of what is now Turkmenistan, in a great oasis created by the Murghab River as it flowed out of the mountains of Afghanistan and spread across the desert in a wide, life-giving fan of water and silt. In the middle of one of the driest places on Earth, Merv was a green miracle. It was a city of gardens, of canals, of libraries, of mosques, of caravanserais, where merchants from China and India and Persia and Byzantium could shelter and trade. It was, for several hundred years, one of the great intellectual centers of the entire Islamic world. Scholars came there to study, poets came there to write, astronomers built observatories, philosophers held debates that were read and argued over from Baghdad to Samarkand. And then, in 1221, the Mongols arrived. The Mongol commander who destroyed Merv was a general named Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan. The siege lasted less than a week. The city surrendered, hoping for mercy. There was no mercy. What followed was one of the most complete acts of urban destruction in human history. Contemporary sources, both Islamic and Mongolian, describe a massacre that lasted for days. The canals that had kept the oasis alive for thousands of years were deliberately cut and filled with rubble. The irrigation system, which had taken centuries to build and maintain, and which was the whole reason a city could exist in this desert in the first place, was systematically destroyed. The libraries were burned. The mosques were torn down. The scholars and astronomers and poets were killed alongside the merchants and farmers and craftspeople. Persian historian Ibn al-Athir, who lived through the Mongol conquests and wrote about them, described what happened at Merv with a grief so raw it still reads as grief 900 years later. He wrote that the catastrophe was so great that he had been unable to bring himself to write about it for years, and that he wished he had been dead before seeing such things. The death toll at Merv is estimated, by medieval sources, at over 1 million people. Modern historians are skeptical of that exact number, as medieval chroniclers often inflated figures for rhetorical effect. But the archaeological evidence confirms that the city was effectively depopulated. The site was never rebuilt to anything approaching its former scale. Some people did return in later centuries. Timur, the great Turco-Mongol conqueror, passed through in the 14th century. A small city persisted at the site into the modern era, but the Great Merv, the Merv of libraries and gardens and 1 million souls, was gone in a single catastrophic week and never came back. What makes Merv a mystery, and not merely a tragedy, is what has not yet been found beneath its ruins. The site is now a UNESCO World Heritage Area in Turkmenistan, and archaeologists have been working there since the Soviet era. What they have found is extraordinary in breadth, but frustratingly incomplete in depth. The remains of multiple successive cities overlie one another, going back nearly 5,000 years. There are Bronze Age settlements beneath Achaemenid Persian layers, beneath Hellenistic Greek layers, beneath Parthian layers, beneath Sassanid Persian layers, beneath early Islamic layers, beneath the great Seljuk city that the Mongols destroyed. Each layer is a civilization. And the deepest layers, the ones that would tell us the most about the very earliest city on this spot, are largely unreached, buried beneath millennia of other cities and the accumulated rubble of a dozen successive catastrophes. What was at the very bottom of Merv? What was the city that first looked at that desert oasis and decided to call it home? What did the irrigation engineers who first cut the canals that fed the city look like, and what gods did they pray to, and what language did they speak? The archaeology has not reached them yet. The layers above are too thick, the preservation conditions too variable, the resources too limited, and the history too vast. The city that was once the largest on Earth is also, in its deepest and oldest form, still largely unknown to us. There is a particular quality to the landscape of southern Arabia that you have to try to hold in your mind to understand why the legend of Ubar persists with such power. The Rub al-Khali does not look like a place that could support civilization. It is not a landscape that invites the human eye to rest anywhere comfortably. The dunes move. They are always moving, shifted by the wind in patterns that would erase a footprint within hours of it being made. The horizon shimmers with heat in the day and fills with hard, brilliant stars at night. Stars that are extraordinary in their number and their clarity because there is no moisture in the air, no dust fine enough to soften the light. You can see more stars from the interior of the Rub al-Khali than you can see from almost anywhere else on Earth. And the Bedouin, who have navigated this desert for thousands of years, use those stars the way sailors use them, as a map written in light across the ceiling of the world. It is worth spending a moment thinking about the frankincense trade, because it is the frankincense trade that explains why Ubar had to exist, even before we find it. In the ancient world, frankincense was not merely a pleasant smell, it was a substance of profound religious significance, used in the rituals of civilizations from Rome to Egypt to Greece to the kingdoms of the Levant to the trading cities of India. The demand for it was constant, enormous, and geographically concentrated. The trees that produced it, Boswellia sacra, grew primarily in the mountains and coastal highlands of what is now Dhofar in southern Oman and in adjacent parts of Yemen. Nowhere else in the world, or at least nowhere else accessible to the ancient trading networks, produced frankincense in the quantities that the ancient world required, which means that someone had to move it. Someone had to organize the collection of frankincense resin from the trees, the packing of it into containers, the loading of those containers onto camels, and the long, dangerous, enormously profitable journey north across the Arabian Peninsula to the ports and caravan cities where the rest of the world could buy it. That someone needed water, they needed food, they needed shelter from the heat of the day and the cold of the desert night. They needed a place where camels could drink, where sick travelers could rest, where merchants from different regions could meet and negotiate and trade. In the middle of a desert that offered almost none of these things naturally, they needed a city. And so Ubar existed, had to exist, as a node in one of the most important long-distance trade networks of the ancient world, whether or not we have found it definitively yet. The economics of the frankincense trade virtually require a city like the one the legends describe. The question is not whether such a place was built. The question is exactly where it was, and exactly what became of it. The sinkholes of Dhofar are a real geological phenomenon. The limestone plateau that underlies much of this region is riddled with karst formations, honeycombed with chambers and passages created by the slow work of slightly acidic groundwater dissolving rock over millions of years. These cavities can be stable for very long periods and then fail suddenly, catastrophically, without warning. The ground above them shows no sign of what is happening below until the moment when it does, and then what happens is what happened at Shiza. The surface drops, buildings fall. The entire human effort above the void goes down into the void, and the void receives it and is silent. This geological reality adds a layer of physical credibility to the traditions that describe the city as having been swallowed by the earth. It was not metaphor. It was, in the specific case of Shiza, and possibly in the case of other sites in the region, a literal geological event. The earth did open, the city did fall in. What the archaeologists who worked at Shiza found when they excavated was not just the ruins of a trading post. They found evidence of continuous human occupation stretching back thousands of years, a site that had been important to the people of southern Arabia for far longer than the period of its most intensive use. There were artifacts suggesting trade connections not just with the Hellenistic and Roman world, but with earlier civilizations, with the kingdoms of ancient South Arabia, with the Mesopotamian world to the north, The site had been a node in a trading network that predated the heyday of the frankincense trade by centuries, and when it collapsed into its sinkhole, it collapsed with all of that accumulated history inside it. We have the surface. We have what the archaeologists could reach before the walls of the excavation became unstable. The deeper layers, the older history, the earliest human occupation of this particular water source in the middle of the desert that is still down there in the sinkhole, in the darkness, with whatever else the earth decided to keep. The oral traditions of the Bedouin who live in and around the Dhofar region are not simple. They are not the kinds of stories that can be dismissed as folk tales that grew to fill an information vacuum. They contain specific geographic details, references to particular wadis and particular rock formations and particular wells that match the landscape in ways that would require either an astonishing coincidence or an actual deep memory of what the landscape looked like before the catastrophe changed it. When Bedouin guides told Bertram Thomas in 1930 that the old roads led to a place where a city had fallen into the earth, they were not making something up to impress a foreign explorer. They were passing on something that had been passed on to them, something that someone in their tradition had seen, or seen the aftermath of, and had thought important enough to remember. The relationship between desert peoples and their landscape is one of the most intimate that human beings can develop. In an environment where a wrong turn can mean death, where knowledge of water sources is the most precious knowledge there is, where the ground itself is an archive of information about weather and danger and resource, you do not forget what the ground looked like. You do not forget where the water was. You do not forget where the city stood before the earth took it. You pass that knowledge on, generation by generation, wrapped in language that changes and accumulates meaning but does not lose its core geographic content. The Bedouin remembered Ubar because forgetting would have been a kind of death. The desert does not permit forgetting what matters. There is something particularly affecting about the story of Guapondali that becomes clear only when you think about the sequence of events from the perspective of the Canary people who built it. They built a city. They built it well enough and made it significant enough that when the Incas conquered them, the conquerors recognized the city's importance and elevated it to one of the 4 royal seats of the greatest empire in the Western Hemisphere. That is not the kind of recognition that goes to an ordinary settlement. The Incas knew cities. They had built them across the length of the Andes, from what is now Colombia to what is now Chile, a distance of more than 4,000 kilometers. They had administrative centers and ritual centers and military centers and commercial centers scattered from the Pacific coast to the eastern jungle. And when they arrived in the highland valley where Guapondelig sat in the clouds, they said, essentially, this is important. This belongs at the center of what we are building. This deserves to be one of our capitals. And then the Incas built more on top of what the Canary had made. They added the temples and the palaces and the administrative infrastructure that characterized their great cities. They brought in Mitmakuna, the resettlement populations that the Inca used to consolidate control over newly conquered regions, people from other parts of the empire who would dilute local loyalties and bring Inca practices into the cultural mix. They brought Quechua, the Inca language, into a region that had spoken the Canary language for generations. They changed the name of the city from Guapondelig to Tomobamba, as we discussed, the Plain of Knives. And for a period of perhaps 50 or 60 years, Tomobamba was one of the most important places in the Inca world. A place where the roads of the empire converged, where the great highland trade routes crossed, where the children of the Inca nobility came to receive parts of their education. The Spanish soldier, Pedro de Chiesa de Leon, who travelled through the region in the 1540s, only a decade after the Inca Civil War had largely destroyed Tomobamba, wrote about what he saw, with a mixture of awe and grief that is extraordinarily vivid, even 5 centuries later. He described the walls of great buildings still standing, the carved stones still in place, the traces of the gold-sheathed temple to the sun visible in what remained of the foundation. He described local people showing him where the great buildings had stood before the Civil War soldiers tore them down. He described the overall impression of a place that had clearly been magnificent and was now a magnificent ruin. And he was writing about this only 15 years after the destruction, which means that the people he spoke with, The people who pointed out where the buildings had been had seen those buildings standing. They remembered Tomobamba in its glory. They were eyewitnesses to its end. Those eyewitnesses are long dead. Their grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren are the people of Cuenca today, and most of them know something about the archaeological layers beneath their city, but they cannot access those layers with their own senses. The city that Cieza de León saw the ruins of is now 4 or 5 meters below the surface of a modern Ecuadorian city. The city that the Canary built before the Inca arrived, the city that impressed the Inca enough to make it their own, is deeper still. And the earliest human occupation of that highland valley, the people who first looked at a green plain surrounded by Andean peaks and saw the possibility of a great city, those people are deepest of all. 3 cities, one on top of another, in the earth beneath Cuenca, waiting, as lost cities always wait, for the question that will finally be asked in exactly the right way, with exactly the right tools to make them speak. The Canary people, it should be noted, are still there. They are still in the Ecuadorian highlands. They have maintained a distinct identity and a distinct culture through the Inca conquest and the Spanish conquest and the colonial period and independence and everything else that 500 years of Ecuadorian history has contained. They know who their ancestors were. They know what their ancestors built. But the full scope of what was built, the complete picture of Guapondolí at the height of its own independent power, before the Incas came, is something that even the Canary's own historical memory cannot fully reconstruct. The city was lost not just to us, but, in some ways, to its own descendants. And that is a particular kind of loss, one that carries its own specific weight. What the libraries of Merv contained is one of the great hypothetical losses of intellectual history. We know they existed because multiple sources mention them. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the most famous library in the early Islamic world, was built in part by scholars who had trained and worked in Merv and in the other great Central Asian cities that were then, in the 8th and 9th centuries CE, among the most intellectually active places on earth. The tradition of learning that produced al-Biruni, one of the greatest encyclopedic scholars of the medieval Islamic world, was rooted in Central Asian cities, of which Merv was the most prominent. What was in those libraries? We know that they contained works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, history, poetry. We know that some of the works they contained were translations of Greek texts, preserved in Arabic at a time when those texts were largely unknown in Western Europe. We know that others were original works, created by scholars whose names we sometimes know, and whose surviving works we treasure, and whose lost works we can only guess at from references in other texts. When the Mongols came, those libraries burned, not symbolically, literally. The particular horror of what Tolui did at Merv in 1221 is not just the scale of the killing, but the comprehensiveness of the destruction. A library is not just the books it contains. It is also the scholars who read and annotate and copy and extend and argue with those books. It is the institutional memory of generations of learned people, the network of teachers and students and patrons and critics that keeps knowledge alive and growing. When you kill all the scholars and burn all the books, you do not just destroy what was written down, you destroy the living tradition that would have continued to produce new writing, new thought, new understanding. The libraries of Merv were not just collections of texts, they were engines of intellectual production, and those engines were destroyed in a week. We do not know exactly what was in them. This is the nature of the loss. A destroyed library does not leave a catalogue. Some texts survived because copies existed elsewhere, in Baghdad or in Nishapur or in the libraries of scholars who were travelling when the Mongols arrived and did not come back to find ash. Others survived because individual scholars memorized them, or because fragments were copied into other works before the originals were lost. But the specific holdings of the libraries of Merv, the texts that existed there and nowhere else, the works that were unique to that collection, we will never know what they were. We know only that they existed and that they are gone. The irrigation system of Merv is almost as significant a loss, in practical human terms, as the libraries. The system that made life possible in the Murghab River oasis was not a simple network of canals. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated, hydraulic engineering achievement, developed over more than 2,000 years by successive civilizations, each of which had inherited the system, maintained it, extended it, and made it more capable. By the time the Mongols arrived, the irrigation system of Merv was capable of distributing water to agricultural land across a vast area, sustaining not just the city, but a dense agricultural hinterland that produced food for the entire region. The system included main canals drawn from the river, secondary distribution canals, tertiary channels for individual fields, settling tanks to remove silt from the water, measuring weirs to control flow rates, and a complex administrative system for allocating water rights among the many communities that depended on it. When the Mongols destroyed the canals of Merv, they were not simply blocking a water supply. They were destroying the accumulated hydraulic knowledge of more than 2,000 years. The knowledge of where to build the intakes, how to maintain the gradient of the channels, which fields needed more water and which needed less, how to flush the system when it silted up, how to repair it when the spring floods damaged it. All of that knowledge was held by the people who maintained the system, and those people were killed. The physical infrastructure could theoretically have been rebuilt if the knowledge of how to build and maintain it had survived. Without that knowledge, the desert reclaimed the oasis with remarkable speed. The land that had fed a city of 1 million people for centuries reverted to dust within decades of the Mongol destruction. The physical fact of the landscape, the water table, the soil composition, the gradient of the terrain, none of that changed. What changed was the human knowledge of how to use it. And human knowledge, when it is destroyed, does not grow back automatically. It has to be rebuilt from scratch, slowly, painfully, and it never quite takes the same form that it had before. The question of what brought down the Khmer Empire is one that has preoccupied Southeast Asian historians for decades, and the evidence from the LiDAR surveys has added new complexity to a picture that was already complicated. The hydraulic network that the LiDAR revealed was not just impressive in scale. It was, when looked at carefully, also revealing in its internal contradictions and its signs of stress. The system that had been designed to manage water across an enormous landscape had, over the centuries of the empire's peak, been modified and extended and added to in ways that were not always consistent with the original design logic. There are places in the LiDAR-mapped landscape where channels from different periods cross each other at awkward angles, suggesting that later engineers were trying to solve problems created by earlier decisions. There are places where sediment cores show evidence of repeated flooding, suggesting that the system was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. There are signs of repairs made in haste, of modifications that addressed immediate problems while creating new ones downstream. This is a phenomenon that historians of hydraulic civilization have identified in other contexts as well. Large water management systems tend, over time, to accumulate complexity in ways that make them progressively harder to maintain and harder to adapt to changing conditions. Each generation of engineers inherits a system that was designed for conditions that may no longer fully apply, and each generation of engineers makes modifications that address immediate needs while adding to the complexity that the next generation will have to manage. At some point, the system becomes so complex, so full of interdependencies and compromises and patches that a significant stress, a drought, a flood, a political disruption that prevents normal maintenance can cause cascading failures that the original designers could not have anticipated. The hydraulic system that sustained Angkor for 5 centuries was both its greatest achievement and perhaps the mechanism of its eventual failure. And then there was the climate. Tree ring records from the region, analysed in the 21st century, show a pattern of severe droughts interspersed with intense monsoon seasons in the period between the late 14th and early 15th centuries, precisely the period when Angkor was being abandoned. A drought would have reduced the water available for agriculture, straining the city's food supply, but a drought, followed by an extremely intense monsoon season, which is exactly the pattern that the tree ring records suggest, would have been even more dangerous for a hydraulic system already operating at the edge of its capacity. The drought would have reduced maintenance activity as people focused on survival rather than infrastructure upkeep. Then the intense rains would have hit a system that had not been properly maintained, causing floods and channel failures on a scale that the deferred maintenance could not have addressed. We are talking, in other words, about a city that was brought down not by a single catastrophe, but by the accumulation of stresses that each individually would have been manageable, but together and in sequence proved overwhelming. This is not a story about weakness or incompetence. The Khmer were extraordinary engineers. They built a hydraulic system that sustained a city of 1 million people in a monsoon climate for 500 years, which is a remarkable achievement by any measure. The story of Angkor's decline is a story about the limits of human ingenuity in the face of environmental change at a scale and in a form that exceeded the assumptions on which the city's systems had been designed. It is a story, in other words, that has a great deal of relevance to the world we are living in now. The forest that covers the ghost of Angkor's outer city today is not the ancient primeval forest that was there before the city was built. It is a secondary forest, a forest that grew up in the centuries after the city was abandoned, on land that had been cleared and farmed and managed for 500 years. The trees that stand there now are, in geological time, very young. Beneath their roots, the earthworks of the city persist, compressed and partly dissolved, but still holding their shapes, still legible to the right instruments. In some areas, villagers who have lived in and around the forest for generations have incorporated ancient mounds and platforms into their own landscape management, building their houses on the slightly elevated ground of old Khmer platforms without necessarily knowing what those platforms were. The old city is still there, still part of the living landscape in ways that are not always visible. It is just that the living and the dead have learned, over 700 years, to coexist. The fourth city leads us across the world again, this time to the jungles of Southeast Asia, to a country now called Cambodia, and to a civilization so extraordinary that when European explorers first encountered the ruins of what it had built, many of them simply refused to believe that the people living around those ruins could be the descendants of the people who had created them. They invented other explanations. They suggested that Alexander the Great had somehow reached the jungles of Cambodia and built it. They proposed that it was the work of the Romans, or the Chinese, or some other civilization more familiar to them than the idea that the peoples of mainland Southeast Asia had, on their own and without outside instruction, constructed one of the greatest urban complexes in the history of the world. The civilization in question is, of course, the Khmer Empire. The ruins they left behind at Angkor are well known, at least in outline. Angkor Wat is one of the most visited archaeological sites on Earth. But what is far less well known, and what makes the Khmer Empire genuinely one of history's great mysteries, is not what has been found at Angkor, but what has not been found. Because Angkor Wat and the other great temples that survive were not, in themselves, the city. They were the sacred core of a city, and the city around them, the actual urban fabric in which somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million people lived during the empire's peak in the 12th and 13th centuries CE, has largely vanished. Not because it was destroyed, at least not entirely, but because it was built from materials that do not survive. The Khmer built their temples from stone. Those survive, but they built their houses, their markets, their hospitals, their roads, their administrative buildings, virtually everything that ordinary life happened in, from wood and thatch and bamboo. And wood and thatch and bamboo, in the heat and humidity of the Cambodian jungle, do not last. They dissolve back into the forest. They are eaten by insects, consumed by moisture, swallowed by root systems that spread and crack and reclaim. The sacred stone core of Angkor has been sitting in the jungle for centuries, stubbornly refusing to disappear because stone refuses to disappear. But the city that surrounded it, the city where real people went to market and argued about politics and raised their children and fell in love and grew old and died, that city is gone, almost completely gone. What we have is the stone and the carvings on the stone, and what we can read in those carvings. The bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat and at the Bayon Temple are extraordinary documents of everyday life. They show markets, they show cockfights, they show women preparing food, soldiers marching, merchants trading, children playing. They are the best record we have of what the living city looked like, and they are carved in stone precisely because stone was meant for eternity, while wood was understood to be temporary. But in recent years, LiDAR technology has begun to change what we know, or rather to confirm and extend what archaeologists had long suspected. When researchers flew aircraft equipped with LiDAR scanners over the jungle around Angkor, the lasers penetrated the tree canopy and mapped the ground beneath. What they found was staggering. Beneath the jungle, invisible at ground level but perfectly legible to the technology, was the ghost of an enormous urban landscape. There were roads, there were canals, there were the raised platforms on which wooden buildings had once stood. There were ponds and reservoirs, neighborhoods and districts. The entire infrastructure of a vast medieval city, still there in outline, still holding its shape after 700 years of jungle growth, waiting to be read. What the LiDAR showed us was that Angkor was not just large. It was the largest pre-industrial city in human history, larger than any medieval European city, larger than anything in the medieval Islamic world, larger than contemporary medieval China's greatest urban centers. A city of somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, in its absolute peak, spread across a landscape that covered nearly 1,000 square miles. And almost all of it was built from wood, and almost all of that wood is gone. The greatest city the medieval world contained has left us its stone heart and its earthen skeleton, and almost nothing else. We know it was there because the ground remembers. We know roughly how big it was because the canals and the pond mounds and the raised platforms are still legible to a laser beam. But the lives lived in that city, the sounds of it, the smells of it, the 1,000 years of daily human experience that happened in those wooden buildings, on those raised platforms beside those canals. All of that is lost. The jungle has it, and the jungle does not give things back. This leaves us with one of the deepest puzzles of Southeast Asian history, which is not so much the question of what the city looked like, but the question of what happened to it. Why did the Khmer Empire collapse? Why did a civilization that had maintained a city of this size, with this level of hydraulic engineering and agricultural sophistication for over 5 centuries, suddenly find itself unable to do so? Why did the population abandon Angkor in the 15th century, moving south toward what is now Phnom Penh, leaving the temples to the jungle and the centuries? There are theories. There are droughts reconstructed from tree ring records. There are arguments about the overextension of the hydraulic system, about Thai military pressure from the west, about changes in maritime trade routes that made the interior of mainland Southeast Asia less economically relevant. All of these factors probably played a role, but the full answer is still not settled. The greatest city of the medieval world lost itself in the jungle, and we are still working out exactly why. Our 5th lost city tonight is one that almost every educated person in the world has heard of, and yet one that almost no one could tell you anything concrete about beyond its name. It is a city that has fascinated scholars and explorers and dreamers for 2,500 years. It has generated more books, more expeditions, more theories, and more arguments than any other lost city in human history. You already know its name. You have probably known it since childhood. It is Atlantis. But tonight, we are not going to chase the myth. We are going to do something more interesting and more honest than that. We are going to look at what Plato actually said, why he said it, and what the real world might contain that his account, however fantastically embellished, might be pointing toward. Plato introduced Atlantis in 2 of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. He presented it as a story that the Athenian statesman Solon had supposedly heard from Egyptian priests during a visit to Egypt, a story that was already, by Solon's time, supposedly 9,000 years old. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, was an island empire in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the ancient Greeks called the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a confederation of powerful kings descended from the sea god Poseidon. It was fabulously wealthy, technologically advanced, and militarily dominant. It had conquered large parts of Europe and Africa, and then, in a single day and night of catastrophic violence, it had sunk beneath the ocean, Most classical scholars believe that Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical device, a fictional counterpart to his idealized Athens, a way of illustrating the corruption that power brings and the punishment that hubris invites. This is almost certainly true, at least in part. The story as Plato tells it has the clearly shaped quality of a philosophical parable, complete with moral arc and convenient disaster. But here is where things get genuinely interesting. The details Plato included in his account are oddly specific and oddly consistent with real places and real events that we know from other sources actually occurred. The most compelling real-world candidate for the kernel of truth inside the Atlantis myth is the Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete and its satellite islands in the Aegean Sea. The Minoans were, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient Bronze Age. They built palace complexes of extraordinary sophistication at Knossos and Phaistos and other sites, with running water, painted frescoes, a written script that scholars still cannot fully read, and a trading network that extended across the entire eastern Mediterranean. They were the dominant naval power of their region for centuries, and around 1600 BCE, they suffered a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. On the island of Thera, now called Santorini, a volcano erupted. Not a small eruption. The Thera eruption is estimated by geologists to have been one of the most powerful volcanic events in the last 10,000 years. It expelled somewhere between 60 and 100 cubic kilometers of material. The explosion would have been heard, literally heard as a sound, across an area spanning most of the known ancient world. The ash cloud blocked sunlight across the eastern Mediterranean for months, and the tsunami, generated by the collapse of the volcanic caldera, struck the north coast of Crete and every other coastline within range, with waves that some geographers estimate at 30 to 40 meters in height. The Minoan civilization did not immediately disappear after the Thera eruption. The latest archaeological evidence suggests that the palaces continued for another century or more, but they were clearly weakened, clearly destabilized, and by around 1450 BCE, Minoan power had collapsed and the Mycenaean Greeks had taken over the palace at Knossos. The civilization that had dominated the Aegean for centuries was gone, and the memory of that civilization and of the catastrophe that began its end persisted in the cultures of the eastern Mediterranean long after the event itself. By the time Plato was writing, more than 1,000 years had passed since the Bronze Age collapse. The Minoans were not a memory that anyone in the classical Greek world held consciously, but cultural memories are long, especially when they are attached to catastrophic events. And when Plato wrote about a powerful island empire that was consumed by the sea in a single catastrophic moment, he may have been drawing, however indirectly and however elaborated by centuries of retelling, on the deep cultural echo of what had happened to the Aegean world in the Bronze Age. None of this proves that Atlantis was real. It doesn't. What it suggests is that behind the elaborate philosophical fiction that Plato created, there may have been a real event, real islands, and a real lost civilization powerful enough to leave a cultural echo that lasted 1,000 years before someone finally wrote it down. The Minoans had a written language, as we mentioned, a script called Linear A that has never been deciphered. We cannot read what they wrote about themselves. We cannot read their history, their beliefs, their account of the catastrophe they experienced. Their story is told entirely by the archaeology, by the frescoes and the pottery and the palace plans and the ash layers in the sediment record, and by the echo that may or may not survive in Plato's myth. The civilization that may have inspired the greatest lost city legend in history is itself, in its own way, lost to us. The sixth city brings us to one of the most haunted stretches of coastline in the world, the North Sea coast of what is now the Netherlands and Germany, where the sea and the land have been fighting a slow war for thousands of years, and where the sea has been, with terrible patience and occasional catastrophic violence, winning. The city we are looking for is called Rungholt, and while it is a name that most people outside of Germany and the Netherlands have never heard, it is a name that carries, in those regions, the same kind of weight that Atlantis carries in the wider world. It is what people there mean when they say something was swallowed by the sea. Rungholt was a city on the island of Strand, in what was then the Duchy of Schleswig, which is now the border region between Germany and Denmark. At its peak, in the 13th and 14th centuries CE, it was one of the most prosperous trading cities on the entire North Sea coast. It sat at the intersection of the trade routes that connected England and Scandinavia with the cities of northern Germany and the Low Countries. It had a harbour where merchant ships loaded and unloaded goods from across northern Europe. It had a cathedral, a great stone church whose tower was tall enough to serve as a landmark for ships navigating the shallow, treacherous waters of the Wadden Sea. It had streets and markets and warehouses and all the machinery of a functioning medieval port city. Contemporary sources suggest that perhaps 2,000 people lived there, which in the context of 14th century northern Europe made it a city of meaningful size and significance. And then, on a night in January 1362, a storm came in off the North Sea. The storm that struck the North Sea coast on the 16th of January 1362 is still remembered in German and Dutch historical records as the Grote Mandrenke, the Great Drowning of Men. A massive low-pressure system generated winds of extraordinary force, and those winds drove the sea inland across the flat coastal marshes of the Frisian coast with a speed and violence that left almost no time for escape. The storm surge, the wall of water that the wind pushed in front of it, was estimated at several meters above normal sea level. It struck at night, when most people were sleeping. It crossed the sea walls and the dikes that the coastal communities had built to protect themselves. It flooded the low-lying islands. It scoured out the marshes. It turned solid land into open sea in the space of a single night. Contemporary accounts describe 25,000 people drowned across the region in a single night. Rungholt was not merely flooded, it was completely submerged. The storm surge that crossed the island of Strand did not just cover the city in water, it rearranged the landscape entirely. The sandbanks and mudflats that had surrounded the island were reshaped by the violence of the water. The island of Strand was itself largely destroyed, reduced to a fraction of its former size. The city of Rungholt, which had been on the flat coastal marshland, was now at the bottom of the Wadden Sea, buried under sand and silt, and the slow accumulation of everything that the North Sea deposits when it is left undisturbed. For several centuries afterward, the city passed from history into legend. Fishermen on the Wadden Sea reported that on certain days, in certain conditions of tide and visibility, they could see the ruins of old buildings below the surface of the shallow water. They said that on very still days, if you put your ear to the water, you could hear the cathedral bells of Rungholt ringing beneath the waves. This last detail is almost certainly invention, the kind of melancholy poetry that communities attach to their dead places. But the fishermen's reports of visible ruins were not invention. In the early 20th century, a local schoolteacher named Andreas Busch began systematically searching the mudflats of the Wadden Sea during low tides. He found things. He found medieval pottery, medieval artifacts, the remains of wooden structures, traces of what had clearly been a substantial settlement. He published his findings and established, to the satisfaction of most historians, that Rungholt was not entirely myth. It had been real, and it was down there, in the mud. More recent archaeological work has confirmed and extended Busch's findings. During extremely low tides, the exposed mudflats of the Wadden Sea reveal traces of Rungholt's streets and foundations, the outlines of buildings preserved in the silt. Archaeologists have recovered artifacts that tell us about daily life in the city: pottery, tools, animal bones, the mundane detritus of a community that was alive and then was not. But the full extent of the city, its harbour, its cathedral, the neighbourhoods that lay under deeper water, has still not been fully mapped. The Wadden Sea is shallow, but it is vast, and the tide windows for archaeological work are narrow, and the preservation conditions are variable. Rungholt is not entirely lost, but it is not entirely found either. It is there in the mud and the silt and the cold grey water, giving up its secrets slowly, one low tide at a time. What gives Rungholt its particular power as a lost city is not just the drama of its ending, but the ordinariness of the life it contained before that ending. This was not an empire's capital. It was not a sacred city or a royal seat. It was a trading port, a community of merchants and fishermen and craftspeople who had built a comfortable life on the edge of the sea, who had learned to live with the sea's moods, and whose parents and grandparents had built sea walls against its anger. They thought they had made accommodation with it. They were wrong. The sea's anger, when it finally came properly, was beyond anything their sea walls had been designed to withstand. And the ordinary life they had built, the streets and the church and the harbour and the market, went under the water in a single night and has been there ever since. The Minoan world, as best as we can reconstruct it from the archaeology, was not the barbaric world that the myths of Theseus and the Minotaur might suggest. The palace at Knossos, which Sir Arthur Evans excavated beginning in 1900, is a building of astonishing sophistication. It has a plumbing system, with clay pipes running through the structure that used a primitive form of pressure flow to deliver water to upper floors. It has a drainage system connected to an external sewer. It has ventilation shafts designed to move air through the building and moderate the temperature of the interior rooms. It has a set of storage magazines, long narrow rooms, lined with great storage jars called pithoi that could contain the agricultural surplus of a large territory in a way that suggests a highly organized administrative system for collecting, storing, and distributing resources. It is not the palace of a primitive people who stumbled into architecture. It is the palace of a people who had been building and refining their building tradition for hundreds of years, and who understood, in a highly practical way, how to create a complex built environment. The frescoes at Knossos and at other Minoan sites are the aspect of the culture that most people respond to most immediately, and for good reason. They are extraordinary. There is a famous fresco called the Toreador fresco, or the bull leaping fresco, which shows athletic figures, both male and female, performing what appears to be an acrobatic ritual involving a charging bull. One figure grabs the bull's horns, another performs a backflip over the bull's back. A third stands at the far end, ready to catch. Whether this represents an actual athletic performance, a religious ritual, or a mythologized depiction of something else entirely, we cannot be sure. But the painting itself is full of life, full of movement, full of what feels like genuine excitement about the human body in motion. It does not feel like the art of a dead civilization. It feels like the art of people who were very much alive and who found things worth celebrating. And then there is the matter of Linear A. The Minoans had a writing system. We can see it on clay tablets, on small administrative documents, on the large stone objects called libation tables that appear to have been used in ritual contexts. The writing system is clearly related to the later Linear B script, which the Mycenaean Greeks used to write an early form of Greek and which was deciphered in 1952. But Linear A itself remains undeciphered. We know the sound values of some of the signs, because those signs were borrowed into Linear B with the same phonetic values. But the Minoan language itself, the language that Linear A was designed to write, is a language isolate, a language apparently unrelated to any other known language family, and without that linguistic connection, even knowing some of the sound values is not enough to understand the meaning of the texts. The Minoans wrote things down, and they wrote enough things down that a substantial corpus of texts survives, and we cannot read any of it. We are sitting on a library we cannot open. This is the particular agony of the Minoan mystery. If we could read Linear A, we would know what the Minoans called themselves, what language they spoke at home and in the market, what they thought about the gods they worshipped, what they said about their own history, what account they gave of the volcanic catastrophe that destabilized their civilization. We would, in short, have access to an ancient mind in a way that is currently entirely denied to us. The Minoans speak to us only through their objects, their buildings, and their pictures, and that is a rich and rewarding conversation, but it is not the same as hearing them speak. The unlocking of Linear A, if it ever happens, will be one of the great moments of intellectual history. We will, in that moment, meet a people who have been present but inaccessible for more than 3,000 years. The tides of the Wadden Sea are among the most reliable phenomena in the natural world. Twice a day, the sea withdraws, exposing vast mudflats that stretch for kilometers in some places, flat and grey, and smelling of salt and decay, and ancient biology, and twice a day, the sea returns, filling the mudflats again with a speed that can surprise people who have not grown up with it. The Wadden Sea is a tidal sea, and that rhythm, that twice-daily breathing, is the governing fact of life for everything that depends on or works within it. For the archaeology of Rungholt, the tidal cycle is everything. The periods of archaeological work are defined by it. A low tide of sufficient magnitude to expose the relevant layers of mud lasts for perhaps 2 or 3 hours before the water begins to return. In that window, archaeologists wearing waterproof gear and carrying their tools wade out onto the exposed mudflats and work as fast as careful archaeology allows, knowing that the sea is coming back and knowing that it does not negotiate. When the water begins to return, the work stops, the team retreats, and the tide covers everything again until the next suitable low tide, which may be days or weeks away, depending on the lunar cycle and the meteorological conditions. In this constrained and physically demanding way, the archaeology of Rungholt has been conducted for the better part of a century. What has emerged from this intermittent, tide-governed work is a picture of a community that was, in the decades before its destruction, prosperous and confident. The pottery recovered from the mudflats is of good quality. The animal bones suggest a varied diet that included beef and pork and fish and fowl, the diet of people who were not struggling. The structural remains that have been identified suggest buildings of substantial construction, not the flimsy shelters of an impoverished community, but the solid, maintained structures of a place that expected to be there for a long time. The cathedral, whose tower served as a maritime landmark for ships in the Wadden Sea, was almost certainly the largest building in the community, and the fact that it had a tower tall enough to be visible from the sea is itself evidence of civic pride and significant resources. You do not build cathedral towers because you need to. You build them because you can, and because you want to, and because a tower visible from the sea is a statement about who you are. The people of Rungholt knew the sea in the intimate, complicated way that all coastal communities know it. They fished in it and sailed on it and built their harbour to accommodate its moods. They maintained sea walls against it and organised their community in part around the collective work of keeping it at bay. The sea was not alien to them. It was the defining fact of their landscape and their economy and their psychology. And yet the sea killed them, not through negligence or foolishness, but through a scale of violence that exceeded every precaution they had taken, every accommodation they had made, every wall they had built. The Grote Mandrenki of 1362 was not a normal storm. It was an extreme weather event, an outlier in the distribution of storms that struck the North Sea coast, and it arrived with a force that the entire infrastructure of medieval coastal defence was simply not capable of resisting. There is something about the scale of the Grote Mandrenki that is hard to hold in the mind. 25,000 people dead in a single night, across a stretch of coastline that was not wilderness, but was settled and farmed, and built on by communities that had been there for generations. Communities with names and records and property disputes and church registers and all the administrative machinery of medieval life. In a single night, the sea erased them. Not metaphorically, physically. The land they lived on ceased to exist as land and became sea bottom. The farms became mud. The churches became ruins on the sea floor. The people became part of the sea, in the terrible final way that coastal communities have always known was possible and have always lived alongside as an acknowledged risk that did not need to be named on normal days. It was the abnormal day, the catastrophic day, the day when the risk that everyone acknowledged but did not dwell on actually arrived, that ended Rungholt. And yet Rungholt is still there, in its way. It is in the mud. It has been in the mud for 660 years. The sea has not consumed it entirely. The cold, anoxic conditions of the tidal mudflats are actually quite good preservative conditions for certain kinds of organic material, which is why the wooden structural remains can sometimes be found intact, waterlogged but structurally recognizable after 6 centuries of submersion. The mud has kept Rungholt in a kind of cold, suspended animation, waiting for the moments when the tide withdraws and the light falls on what was covered, and archaeologists wade out in their boots to read what was there. 600 years of patience, rewarded for a few hours at a time. The connection between Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili coast trading cities is one of the most important and least widely understood stories in the history of the Indian Ocean world. The Swahili coast, the long eastern coastal strip of Africa from present-day Somalia down through Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, was home in the medieval period to a series of extraordinarily prosperous trading cities. Cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Sofala, and Zanzibar were among the most active commercial centers in the entire Indian Ocean trading world, places where merchants from Arabia and India and Persia and even China came to buy and sell the goods that the African interior produced. Gold, above all, but also ivory, iron, copper, enslaved people, and the products of the great agricultural hinterland that stretched behind the coastal cities for hundreds of miles. Great Zimbabwe sat at the far interior end of one of the most important of these trading systems. The gold that fueled the Swahili coast's prosperity came, in significant part, from the goldfields of what is now Zimbabwe. It was mined, smelted, and transported to the coast by the people of the interior Zimbabwe plateau, the people who built Great Zimbabwe and who were, in their relationship with the coastal trading world, simultaneously suppliers and customers. They sent gold and ivory to the coast. They received, in return, cloth from India, porcelain from China, glass beads manufactured in the workshops of coastal traders, and the prestige goods that marked high social status in their society. The global connections of Great Zimbabwe were real and documented by the artifacts recovered there, and they placed this supposedly isolated interior civilization within a genuinely global commercial network of the medieval world. The Chinese porcelain found at Great Zimbabwe deserves particular attention. It is not just any Chinese porcelain. Some of it is high-quality Celadon ware from the Song and Ming dynasties, the kind of ceramics that were traded throughout the Indian Ocean world as luxury goods, and that ended up in the courts of rulers from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Finding it at Great Zimbabwe tells us that the people who ruled from this stone enclosure on the Zimbabwe plateau were not trading with the coast at the margins of the system, exchanging small amounts of gold for small amounts of foreign goods. They were significant enough players in the regional economy to be receiving goods that had traveled from China through the Indian Ocean system, up the East African coast, and then hundreds of miles inland to this plateau. They had the commercial and political weight to make that trade worthwhile for the coastal merchants who organized it. What does this tell us about the interior life of the Great Zimbabwe civilization? It tells us that the ruling elite were cosmopolitan in a way that is not always acknowledged. They were connected to a world that extended from the eastern coast of Africa to the ports of Arabia and India and the workshops of China. They may not have traveled those trade routes themselves, but the goods that arrived at their gates told them that such routes existed, and the people who brought those goods told them something about the world beyond the plateau. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe were not isolated African chieftains with no knowledge of the wider world. They were informed participants in a global economy who received information about distant places, along with the porcelain and the cloth, and still we do not know their names. We do not know the name of the ruler who commissioned the great enclosure. We do not know the name of the architect who designed the wall, or the workers who built it, or the priests who conducted whatever ceremonies took place inside it. We do not know, with any certainty, what they called themselves. The name Zimbabwe comes from a Shona phrase, Zimba Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone, but whether this is the name that the people of the medieval civilization used, or a later name applied to the ruins, and what name the builders used for their city and for themselves, we cannot say. They built magnificently, they traded across an ocean, they governed a civilization for several centuries, and they did not, or did not in any form that has survived, write it down. Their history is in the stones, and the stones tell only part of the story. The seventh city takes us to a continent that most people do not immediately associate with ancient urbanism, to sub-Saharan Africa, and to a mystery that has been tangled up in centuries of colonial ignorance and willful dismissal in ways that have made it harder, not easier, to understand. The city is Great Zimbabwe, or rather the civilization that Great Zimbabwe was the capital of, because Great Zimbabwe, the city, has actually been found. It is the civilization that built it, and the full extent of the world that civilization contained, that is still imperfectly understood, still partially lost, still being reclaimed from the damage done to historical memory by the people who refused to believe that African builders had made it. Let us start with the stone. Great Zimbabwe is, first and foremost, a physical object of extraordinary power. Situated on a granite plateau in what is now the country of Zimbabwe, roughly 500 miles inland from the Indian Ocean coast, it is the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Its most famous feature is the Great Enclosure, a massive circular stone wall that stands roughly 11 meters high and extends for nearly 250 meters in circumference. The wall is built without mortar, without any binding agent whatsoever. It is constructed entirely from granite blocks, split from the natural granite outcrops of the plateau, and fitted together with a precision that has allowed the wall to stand for 600 to 800 years without major structural failure. The craftsmanship involved in this kind of dry stone construction, particularly at this scale, represents a level of architectural sophistication that took most European traditions considerably longer to achieve. The civilization that built Great Zimbabwe flourished primarily between the 11th and 15th centuries CE, though there is habitation evidence going back much further. At its peak, sometime in the 13th and 14th centuries, the city of Great Zimbabwe housed an estimated 18,000 people, making it a genuinely major urban center for its time and place. The civilization that built it controlled trade routes that connected the gold and ivory of the interior of southern Africa with the trading cities of the East African coast, and through those coastal cities with the wider Indian Ocean trading world. Gold from what is now Zimbabwe was traded as far as China and India. Artifacts recovered from Great Zimbabwe include Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, and glass beads from the coast that were made, in some cases, from materials originating in the Mediterranean. This was not an isolated community. It was a hub in a genuinely global trading network. And then, sometime in the mid-15th century, the city was abandoned. The people who lived there left. They did not leave catastrophically. There is no evidence of conquest, of fire, of massacre. They simply, over a period of years or perhaps decades, stopped being there. The leading theory among historians is that the local ecology around Great Zimbabwe had been degraded by the demands of a large urban population, that the land had been stripped of timber for fuel and construction to the point that it could no longer support the city's needs, and that the population migrated north and west to areas with more abundant resources. A successor state, known to historians as the Mutapa Empire, did indeed arise to the north in roughly this period, and it controlled similar trade routes and seems to have been populated by people related to those who had built Great Zimbabwe. But what is genuinely lost, and what colonial history made more lost by refusing to engage with it honestly, is the full historical record of the civilization that built Great Zimbabwe. When European explorers encountered the ruins in the late 19th century, a significant portion of them refused to accept that indigenous African people had built them. They proposed instead that the ruins were the work of ancient Phoenicians, or Arabs, or the legendary people of Ophir, who were supposed to have supplied King Solomon with gold. These theories were not based on any evidence. They were based on the racist assumption that the people living around the ruins could not possibly be the descendants of its builders. This assumption caused real damage to the archaeological record. Early European investigators dug at the site, carelessly, destructively, without proper documentation, looking for evidence to support their preferred non-African origin theories, and destroying context that would have helped historians understand the site's actual history. One particularly destructive period of amateur excavation in the 1890s removed artifacts without record and may have permanently compromised our ability to understand the site's full chronology. Modern archaeology has established, clearly and without significant dissent, that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people who live in Zimbabwe today. But the damage to the historical record done by those earlier excavations, and by the centuries during which African historical traditions were dismissed, or simply not recorded by those who wrote history, in ways that survived into the present, means that there are questions about Great Zimbabwe that we may never be able to fully answer. What was the political structure of the civilization? What were the specific religious practices that the Great Enclosure was built to contain or facilitate? What language or languages did the ruling elite speak, and how did it relate to the languages spoken by the surrounding population? Who were the great leaders of this civilization, and what did they accomplish beyond what the stones tell us? The stones tell us a great deal, but they do not tell us everything, and what they do not tell us is, in some ways, the most important part of what was lost. The eighth city is one that moves us into territory where archaeology shades into something almost like philosophy, where the lost city is not just a physical place, but a whole category of human organization that we have only recently begun to understand might have been possible. The city is Cahokia, and it sits in the middle of the American continent, in what is now the state of Illinois, directly across the Mississippi River from what would later become the city of St. Louis. And the mystery of Cahokia is not where it was, because we know exactly where it was, or even what it looked like, because the archaeological evidence is remarkably detailed. The mystery of Cahokia is what it means, and what happened to it, and why the civilization that built it chose, at the height of its power and complexity, to disappear so thoroughly that no European who arrived in North America in the 15th and 16th centuries found even a memory of it in the oral traditions of the people living near its ruins. Cahokia was, at its peak, between approximately 1050 and 1200 CE, the largest city north of the Rio Grande in pre-Columbian North America. It covered approximately 8 square miles. It contained somewhere between 100 and 120 earthen mounds, some of them of extraordinary size. The largest, now called Monk's Mound, is a flat-topped earthen pyramid that rises 30 meters above the surrounding plain and covers an area at its base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its platform summit once supported a large wooden building, the nature of which archaeologists are still debating. Was it a palace? A temple? A council house? We do not know. The wood is gone. Only the mound remains, sitting on the flat Illinois plain, like a monument to a civilization that left almost no written record, and that disappeared so completely that even the name Cahokia is not the name its inhabitants used for it. That name comes from a much later people, the Cahokia tribe, who were living in the area when French explorers arrived in the 17th century, and who were themselves apparently unrelated to the people who had built the mounds. At its peak, Cahokia may have housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the city proper, with tens of thousands more in the surrounding satellite communities that depended on it. This was a genuinely urban settlement, not a collection of villages. It had city planning. The mounds were arranged around open plazas in a deliberate spatial organization. There is evidence of a large wooden stockade, a palisade wall, that enclosed the central portion of the city. There are traces of neighborhoods, of distinct areas that may have served different social or functional purposes. There are human remains that show signs of elaborate ritual, including a burial known as Beaded Burial 72, in which a man was found lying on a cape made of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, surrounded by the remains of more than 250 other people, many of them apparently sacrificed for the occasion. Cahokia's economic foundation was agriculture, specifically the intensive cultivation of maize, the crop that the Mississippian culture, of which Cahokia was the supreme expression, had adopted from Mesoamerica and refined into a highly productive system that could support large populations. The city also controlled trade networks that extended across much of the eastern half of North America. Artifacts recovered from Cahokia include copper from the Great Lakes region, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, flint from Arkansas. This was a city connected to a continent, drawing resources and influence from a vast hinterland. And then, sometime between 1200 and 1400 CE, it collapsed. Not through conquest, not through catastrophe, through something that historians are still arguing about. Some emphasize environmental factors, the degradation of the surrounding landscape through agriculture and construction, The deforestation that preceded Merv's collapse by several centuries, but seems to have had similar effects here. Others emphasize political instability, the difficulty of maintaining a complex hierarchical society over multiple generations. Others point to climate data, showing drought periods that would have stressed the agricultural system that the city depended on. And some scholars note something strange in the archaeological record, evidence of increased violence in Cahokia's later centuries, skeletons showing signs of trauma, fortification features that suggest the city felt under threat, either from outside or from within. What makes Cahokia's disappearance so philosophically troubling is the completeness of it. The people of Cahokia did not all die. Populations related to the Mississippian culture persisted in other parts of the eastern United States for centuries after Cahokia itself was abandoned. But the specific urban experiment that Cahokia represented, the attempt to build a city of genuine metropolitan scale in the middle of North America, an experiment that appears to have been remarkably successful for at least a century, was abandoned and never resumed. The people who left Cahokia did not build another Cahokia somewhere else. They dispersed. They went back to smaller communities. Whether this was a choice or a necessity, whether they fled something or simply found that the city, for reasons we cannot fully reconstruct, had ceased to work, is not clear. What is clear is that when Europeans arrived in North America, the largest city that continent had ever seen north of Mexico had been empty for at least a century, and the people who might have told the story of why it had been abandoned were either gone or no longer told that story. We are left with the mounds, and with the silence around them, and with a mystery that sits at the heart of North American history. The ninth city on our journey tonight takes us to the high Andes of Peru, not to Machu Picchu, which has been found and is justly famous, but to a city that the Inca themselves described as one of their sacred places, a city that their oral traditions located in a specific area of the jungle east of the mountains, a city that Spanish conquistadors heard about from Inca survivors in the aftermath of the conquest and spent decades searching for. It is a city that has gone by several names over the centuries, but the one that has stuck, the one that has resonated with the particular frequency of impossible longing, is Paititi. The story of Paititi begins with the Inca. After the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire, which was completed in the 1530s, survivors of the Inca nobility fled into the eastern slopes of the Andes and into the lowland jungle beyond. They established a refuge, a place where Inca resistance could be organized and where the sacred objects, the mummies of the ancestors, the ritual objects of the sun cult, the astronomical knowledge of the priestly classes, could be preserved away from Spanish hands. This refuge, known to historians as the Neo-Inca state of Vilcabamba, was a real place. It was found, eventually, by Spanish military forces in 1572, when the last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed. But in the oral traditions of the surviving Inca and their descendants, Vilcabamba was only one part of the story. There was another place, further east, deeper into the jungle, a place of gold and memory where the Inca had hidden the greatest of their treasures when they saw that the Spanish could not be stopped. This place was Paititi. The Spanish heard the story of Paititi almost immediately after the conquest, because the Inca they captured and questioned kept telling them versions of it. A city in the jungle to the east, where the gold of the empire had been taken. A city where the old ways continued, where the Inca sun god was still worshipped, where the language and the knowledge and the culture of the greatest empire the Americas had ever produced were being preserved against the day when the Spanish could be expelled. Some accounts described Paititi as being on the edge of a great lake. Others placed it at the foot of a specific mountain range. Others described it as a city that could only be reached by traversing a particular river valley, through a jungle that was impenetrable to anyone who did not know the way. The Spanish sent expedition after expedition into the jungle east of the Andes, searching for Paititi. None of them found it. Many of them did not come back. The jungle east of the Andes is one of the most challenging environments on Earth, a dense, wet, biologically complex maze of rivers and swamps and hills and forest that defeated every European who tried to cross it systematically in the 16th and 17th centuries. The few survivors who made it back to the Peruvian highlands brought stories of hardship and occasional glimpses of large settlements visible from rivers, settlements that vanished into the forest before they could be properly investigated, but no gold city. Paititi remained stubbornly beyond reach. Modern investigators have continued the search. Satellite imagery, LiDAR surveys, and aerial reconnaissance have revealed, over the past several decades, a remarkable number of previously unknown archaeological sites in the jungle regions east of the Andes, in what is now the Madre de Dios region of Peru, and in adjacent areas of Bolivia and Brazil. There are earthworks. There are traces of causeways and canals. There are raised platforms and settlement patterns that suggest organized communities living in this jungle region during the pre-Columbian period and possibly after. Some researchers believe that these sites represent the scattered traces of the civilization that the Inca described, a network of communities in the jungle that maintained connections with the Andean world for centuries before European contact and for some years after. But is any of these sites Paititi? And if so, which one? And did Paititi actually exist as the Inca described it, a city of stored treasure and cultural preservation? Or was it something the Inca survivors told the Spanish, partly as a way of giving their conquerors something to chase into the jungle, buying time and space for the actual work of cultural survival that was happening in less spectacular and less findable ways? We do not know. The jungle east of the Andes still contains things that have not been properly surveyed, sites that have not been excavated, communities whose histories have not been recorded. Somewhere in that vast green labyrinth, there are answers to some of these questions. Getting to them is another matter entirely. What stays with you about Paititi, what gives it a quality distinct from the other cities on our journey tonight, is the element of intentional concealment. Most lost cities were lost because they were abandoned, or destroyed, or buried, or simply forgotten over time. Paititi, if the Inca traditions are accurate, was lost because someone hid it, deliberately, carefully, with enormous effort and considerable success. The people who knew where it was chose not to tell the Spanish, and they kept that choice, generation after generation, for 5 centuries. Whatever is in the jungle east of the Andes, whatever the LiDAR and the satellite cameras have not yet found, it is there because someone decided it should be hidden. That is a different kind of mystery than all the others. It is a mystery with a human choice at its center. And that choice, that stubborn, extraordinary act of silence maintained across centuries, is perhaps the most moving thing about the whole story. The question of what Cahokia's religion looked like is one that archaeologists have been working on for decades, and the answers that have emerged are both fascinating and disturbing, in ways that complicate any simple picture of the city as a kind of pre-Columbian democratic utopia. The evidence from the burial mounds, and particularly from the extraordinary burial complex known as Mound 72, suggests a society with profound hierarchical divisions and with ritual practices that involved human sacrifice on a significant scale. The man in beaded burial 72, the one who lay on the 20,000 shell bead bird cape, was clearly a person of extraordinary social status and ritual significance. He was someone around whom the community organized the most elaborate death ritual we have found evidence of in pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico. And the 250 plus people who were buried with him, many in mass graves nearby, were not people who died of natural causes. They were people who were killed as part of the burial ritual. This is not unique to Cahokia. Sacrificial practices, the killing of people to accompany the death of a great leader or to propitiate the forces that governed fate, are documented in many ancient societies across the world. But the scale of what Mound 72 suggests is striking, and it raises questions about the social experience of living in Cahokia that are quite different from the questions raised by the civic planning and the trade connections. Who were those 250 people? Were they willing participants, people who believed that accompanying the great lord in death was an honor and a privilege? Were they enslaved people who had no choice in the matter? Were they prisoners taken in war? Were they members of communities subordinate to Cahokia who were required to provide a certain number of people for this purpose? We do not know. The bones tell us they died, and they tell us approximately how, but they do not tell us the circumstances of their lives or the conditions under which their deaths were organized. The social hierarchy at Cahokia, whatever its exact shape, was clearly real and clearly significant. The city was not an egalitarian community. The mounds were not built by volunteers working in their spare time. They represent an enormous labor investment, hundreds of thousands of person-days of work moving earth basket by basket from the sources to the construction sites. Someone organized that work. Someone directed it. Someone had the authority to demand it from a sufficient number of people to make it possible. The nature of that authority, the political and religious ideology that justified it and made it enforceable, is something we can guess at from the archaeological evidence and from comparisons with other Mississippian societies, for which we have more detailed historical records, but we cannot know it directly. Cahokia left no account of its own political philosophy. The political philosophy is in the mounds, and the mounds speak a language that we are still learning to read. There is a moment in the history of Cahokia that many historians have pointed to as potentially significant in understanding the city's decline, and it is a moment that is visible in the archaeological record with unusual clarity. Around 1050 CE, almost simultaneously with what appears to be the city's founding as a major urban center, there is evidence of a massive communal feast. The archaeological evidence for this event is in the form of an extraordinary density of food remains in a specific area of the site. The remains of a feast large enough to have fed thousands of people, concentrated in a specific time horizon. Something happened around 1050 that brought a very large number of people together for a communal event of considerable scale. And shortly after that event, or perhaps in connection with it, the city's major construction phase began. The great mounds were built, or at least most of them were begun, in a relatively concentrated period following this communal moment. What was that event? Some historians have suggested it was a founding ceremony, a moment when the political and religious leadership that would direct the construction of Cahokia first assembled the community and committed it to the project. Others have pointed to astronomical evidence, specifically to the alignment of certain mound features with astronomical phenomena, and suggested that the founding of Cahokia may have been connected to a specific astronomical event, possibly a particularly dramatic solar event, like a total solar eclipse or a supernova that would have been visible from this location around this time. The supernova of 1054 CE, which produced what we now call the Crab Nebula, and which was visible in the daytime sky across North America for weeks, is one candidate. This was one of the most spectacular astronomical events of the medieval period, and it would have been seen and interpreted as deeply significant by anyone in the world who witnessed it. Whether the people of Cahokia saw the 1054 supernova and incorporated it into a founding mythology, we cannot say. But the timing is suggestive, and the astronomical sophistication implied by the alignment of Cahokia's great wooden post circles, the structures that archaeologists call woodhenge, is sufficient to suggest that the sky was very much on the minds of the people who planned this city. The jungle east of the Andes that separates highland Peru from the Amazon basin is not simply a geographic barrier. It is a world unto itself, one of the most biologically complex environments on Earth, a place where the altitude gradient from the Andean peaks to the lowland forest produces an astonishing range of ecosystems, compressed into a relatively small horizontal distance. In the space of a few hundred kilometers, the landscape descends from alpine grasslands through cloud forests filled with orchids and bromeliads and tree ferns, through increasingly warm and humid montane forests, and finally into the lowland rainforest that stretches for thousands of kilometers eastward to the Atlantic coast. This gradient of environments is also, for human purposes, a gradient of challenges. The cloud forests, the region the Spanish called the montaña, or eyebrow of the jungle, were and remain among the most difficult terrain on Earth for sustained travel. The vegetation is dense and wet. The ground is broken by rivers and ravines. The mists that give cloud forests their name reduce visibility to a few meters. The elevation changes rapidly and unpredictably. Travel through the cloud forest requires not just physical endurance, but a detailed knowledge of the terrain that only comes from years of experience in that specific landscape. The Inca knew this. The cloud forest was a defensive barrier as much as a geographic feature, a barrier that made their eastern frontier effectively impenetrable to the Spanish military technology that had conquered the highlands so devastatingly fast. And it is in this context that Paititi, if it existed, would have been built. Not as a conventional city in a cleared landscape, but as a community adapted to the cloud forest and lower montane forest environments, using the forest itself as its primary defensive asset. A city in this jungle would not have looked like a city in the highlands. The architecture would have been different, adapted to the climate and the available materials. The urban form might have been very different from the great planned cities of the Inca heartland, perhaps more dispersed, more integrated with the forest, more invisible from any position more than a short distance away. A city designed to be hidden would not build great visible landmarks. It would build into the landscape rather than onto it. It would use the rivers as roads and the forest as walls. It would be, in short, exactly the kind of place that would be genuinely difficult to find, even with modern technology. The LiDAR surveys that have been conducted over parts of the Madre de Dios region and adjacent areas have revealed, as we discussed, a remarkable number of previously unmapped archaeological sites. But LiDAR has limits in cloud forest environments. The cloud forest, unlike the drier forests that cover the plains of Cambodia, generates a density of vegetation at multiple levels of the canopy that makes it difficult for the laser beams to reach the ground reliably. There are places where the cloud forest canopy is so thick and so layered that even LiDAR cannot fully penetrate it, which means that there are potentially significant archaeological sites in these environments that are still invisible to our most powerful remote sensing technology. Sites that would only be found by someone on the ground, in the forest, with enough knowledge of the terrain to know where to look. Several South American indigenous communities maintain oral traditions that include references to a great city or a great place in the jungle, a place connected to the Inca world, but distinct from it, a place that their ancestors knew about, and that was deliberately kept from the knowledge of outsiders. These traditions are not the same thing as the Spanish colonial accounts of Paititi, which were filtered through Spanish expectations and Spanish greed and Spanish assumptions about what an important indigenous city would look like. They are their own accounts, with their own logic and their own geographic reference points. Some researchers working in partnership with indigenous communities in the Madre de Dios and Puno regions have begun to take these traditions seriously as potential geographic information rather than as mythology to be explained away. The results of this collaborative approach are still preliminary, but they suggest that the oral traditions contain specific environmental markers, references to particular types of terrain, particular configurations of rivers and hills that might be used to narrow the search area considerably. The terracotta figures of the Nok tradition are not all of the same type. That is something worth understanding. Over the course of the nearly 2,000 years that the tradition endured, the style evolved. The earliest pieces, from the period around 1500 to 500 BCE, are somewhat different in their proportions and in the specific technical details of their production from the later pieces. There are periods of change and periods of relative stability. There are regional variations that suggest the tradition was being practiced across a wide geographic area by communities that were in contact with each other but not identical to each other. The Nok terracotta tradition was not a single workshop producing a single product. It was a cultural practice, distributed across a landscape and sustained across time, that maintained enough coherence to be recognizable as a tradition while also evolving and adapting. This tells us something important. It tells us that the Nok civilization was not a brief flowering and a sudden collapse. It was a long, sustained cultural enterprise that persisted for 20 times longer than the United States has existed, adapting to whatever changes occurred in the environment and the society over those 2 millennia. The scale of that persistence is worth sitting with. 20 generations is a long time to maintain a practice. It requires transmission of knowledge and technique from teacher to student, generation after generation, through whatever disruptions and upheavals those 20 generations experienced. It requires a social value placed on the making of these objects, sufficient to motivate the investment of time and skill over very long time scales. It requires, in short, a genuine civilization, not a temporary cultural moment, but a sustained social enterprise. The iron smelting technology of the Nok people underwent a similar long development. The earliest iron artifacts from the region are from around 550 BCE, and the sophistication of the smelting techniques used suggests that this was not the very beginning of iron experimentation in the area. The technology that produced the earliest surviving iron artifacts was already developed, already mature enough to be reliable and productive, which suggests that there was a period before 550 BCE, a period from which we have no surviving metallic evidence because the earlier experiments may not have produced durable artifacts or may not have been preserved in the archaeological record, during which people in the central Nigerian plateau were learning, experimenting, failing, and gradually succeeding at the extraordinarily difficult technical challenge of producing iron from iron ore. The smelting of iron is genuinely difficult. It requires a furnace capable of reaching temperatures above 1,200 degrees Celsius, which requires both the right fuel and the right furnace design. It requires knowledge of which ores are productive and which are not. It requires understanding of the relationship between the carbon content of the resulting metal and its physical properties, specifically the crucial difference between iron and steel, and how the carbon content of the smelted metal determines which one you get. The Nok iron smelters arrived at a working knowledge of all of this through experiment and through a tradition of technical knowledge transmission that we can only infer from its results. The furnaces have been found. The slag heaps that are the inevitable byproduct of iron smelting have been found. The iron tools and weapons and ornaments have been found. But the knowledge system that produced all of this, the metallurgical understanding that the Nok people developed over generations, that knowledge system ended with the civilization and has to be reconstructed from the physical remains of its products. We can see what they made. We cannot entirely understand how they knew to make it, or what concepts and categories they used to organize their knowledge of the metal and its behavior. This is, once again, the particular quality of loss that attaches to a civilization that did not leave a written record in a form we can read. We have the objects. We have the impressive, enduring, sometimes beautiful objects, but the minds that made the objects, the conceptual frameworks within which those minds operated, the language in which those frameworks were expressed and transmitted, all of that is gone, and the objects, for all their impressiveness, cannot fully substitute for the minds. The 10th and final city on our journey tonight is also, in some ways, the most recent, the most geographically specific, and the most contested. It sits in the plains of West Africa, in what is now Nigeria, in a region that has been at the center of some of the most complex and densely populated human history on the African continent. The city is called Nok, or rather, the civilization is called Nok, after the village near which its artifacts were first discovered in the 1940s. And the mystery of Nok is not that we don't know where it was, or even entirely what it looked like, but that we cannot explain why it appears, fully formed and extraordinarily sophisticated, at the very beginning of our archaeological knowledge of the region, and we cannot explain why it ends with the same abruptness. Nok is known primarily through its terracotta sculpture, and those sculptures are among the most remarkable objects produced anywhere in the ancient world. They were made by a people living in the central Nigerian plateau between roughly 1,500 BCE and 300 CE, a span of nearly 2,000 years. They depict human figures, animals, and elaborate ceremonial subjects in a style that is immediately recognizable and quite unlike anything else being produced in sub-Saharan Africa at the same time. The figures are elongated, stylized, technically sophisticated. They have perforated pupils that suggest the eyes were once inlaid with a contrasting material. The headdresses and jewelry depicted on the figures are complex and varied, suggesting a society with elaborate systems of status and adornment. The craftsmanship required to produce them, both in terms of the clay preparation and the firing techniques, is of a very high order. Beyond the sculptures, the Nok people were also among the earliest known iron-smelting cultures in sub-Saharan Africa. Ironworking technology appeared in the Nok area at roughly 550 BCE, making it one of the earliest centers of African iron production, and the sophistication of the techniques used suggests, to most archaeologists, that this was not a technology that was imported or learned from outside, but one that was developed independently. This is a significant claim with significant implications. It means that the Nok people were not simply passive recipients of technologies developed elsewhere, that they were, in their own right, innovators. People who worked out how to smelt iron in a particular part of West Africa and who left behind iron artifacts alongside their extraordinary sculptures and who built, archaeologists believe, a complex society with agriculture and trade and hierarchy, and then disappeared from the archaeological record around 300 CE as completely as if they had never been there. Where is Nok City? Where is the settlement, or the series of settlements, that housed the people who produced these sculptures over the course of 2,000 years? The archaeology of the Nok region is fragmentary and often damaged, partly because much of the terracotta has been removed from its original context by illegal excavation and sold into the international art market, which has destroyed enormous amounts of contextual information that would have helped historians understand how and where the Nok people lived. Legitimate archaeological excavations have been limited by resources and by the challenges of working in a region that has experienced significant political instability. What has been found suggests that the Nok people lived in dispersed agricultural communities rather than in a single large urban center. But this interpretation may be incomplete, reflecting the limits of what has been systematically excavated rather than the full reality of the settlement patterns. What happened to the Nok civilization around 300 CE is simply not known. The sculptures stopped being made. The ironworking tradition continues, carried forward by successor cultures in the region, but the specific artistic tradition of the Nok terracottas ends. There is no evidence of a major disaster, no sign of mass destruction or abandonment. The culture seems simply to have transformed, to have changed into something that looked different enough that archaeologists classify it as a different cultural period. Whether the people themselves changed, or moved, or died, or simply evolved their practices in ways that produced a different-looking material record is not established. The Nok civilization, like so many of the civilizations on our list tonight, vanished not with a bang, but with a silence that descended over centuries, and from which we have been trying to reconstruct meaning ever since. The Nok terracottas that survive in museums and in the limited number of legitimate private collections around the world are, if you encounter them, deeply affecting. They look at you with those hollow, perforated eyes across a distance of 2,500 years. They are clearly made by people who thought carefully about how to represent the human face, about how to capture something true about the experience of being a person in the world. They are not naive objects. They are not the products of a simple or primitive culture. They are the products of a sophisticated artistic tradition that had been developing for centuries by the time the most elaborate of them were made, and they exist now in isolation, disconnected from the society that produced them, disconnected from the context that would tell us what they meant to the people who made them and who looked at them. That disconnection is, in a sense, the defining condition of all the cities we have visited tonight. We have the stones, and the walls, and the canals, and the earthworks, and the sculptures, and the occasional coin, or pot, or carved inscription. We have the shape of what was built, the outline of what was there. But we have lost, in almost every case, the interior life of these places. We have lost the sounds they made, the languages they spoke and sang in, the gods they called to and the stories they told their children, the arguments they had in their markets, and the songs they sang at their festivals. We have lost the texture of daily life in all these places, the smell of their food and the feel of their clothes, and the names of the people who mattered to them. We have the skeleton, we have lost the flesh, and that is why these cities stay with us, long after we have finished reading about them or listening to stories about them. It is not just the mystery, though the mystery is real and it is compelling. It is the grief of incompleteness. These were real places. Real people built them and lived in them and loved them and worried about them in the way that people have always worried about the places they call home. And the vast majority of what those people were, the vastness of their inner lives and their social worlds and their histories, is gone. We cannot get it back. We can dig, we can analyze, we can use every technology available to us to read what the earth has preserved. And still, the most important things are not there. This is, in the end, what the story of lost cities teaches us most clearly. Not that civilizations are fragile, though they are. Not that catastrophe can arrive without warning, though it can. What it teaches us, if we are willing to sit with it, is the radical contingency of everything we think of as permanent. Every city that exists tonight, every city in which someone is listening to these words right now, is built on the assumption that it will continue, that the systems that keep it going will keep going, that the knowledge that built it will be passed down, that the land beneath it will hold. These are reasonable assumptions. History does not suggest that they are guaranteed. Every stone that was cut to build the walls of Ubar, every plank of wood that went into the buildings of Cahokia, every terracotta figure that a Nok sculptor shaped and fired and set aside, was made by someone who assumed that what they were building would outlast them, who assumed, probably without thinking about it explicitly, that the civilization they were part of was a permanent feature of the world, that the city was not an experiment that might fail, that the future was continuous with the present. They were not entirely wrong. The things they built did outlast them. The walls of Merv and the mounds of Cahokia and the stones of Great Zimbabwe are still in the world, still holding their shapes, still telling us that people were here, that people thought and built and organized themselves into communities and reached for something larger than individual survival. The civilization is gone, but the trace remains. The experiment ended, but the evidence persists. And that is something, in the long context of human history, in the vast space of time during which civilizations have risen and collapsed and been forgotten and been found again, the persistence of a trace is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the reason we can have this conversation at all. The reason we can travel tonight to Ubar and Guapondelig and Merv and Angkor and the sand-covered remains of Atlantis's possible ancestor and the cold water grave of Rungholt and the stone silence of Great Zimbabwe and the cow, earthen mountains of Cahokia and the hidden green depths of Paititi's jungle and the hollow eyes of the Nok terracottas, because something was left, because the earth, for all its indifference, is a good keeper of what is committed to it, not a perfect keeper, not a complete keeper, but a patient one. And patience, in the end, is on our side too. The technology that has illuminated Angkor's ghost city and confirmed the reality of Rungholt and mapped the empty landscape around Cahokia did not exist 50 years ago. The tools that will answer questions we cannot yet fully articulate do not exist today, but will exist in 50 years, or 100, or 200. The cities are not going anywhere, the ones that are still in the ground. They are waiting for us to become capable of reading them properly. And human curiosity, the stubborn, extraordinary, species-defining impulse to know, to understand, to find and map and recover what was lost, that impulse is also not going anywhere. The archaeologist who gets out of bed tomorrow morning and puts on their field clothes and goes to dig in some difficult place because they believe there is something there worth finding is continuing a conversation that has been going on, as long as human beings have had enough history behind them to wonder about. The satellites that map the Earth's surface and the lasers that penetrate its forest canopy are the newest instruments in that conversation. They will not be the last. So sleep well tonight, if sleep is what you came here for. And if you find yourself in that half-awake place between consciousness and rest, where the mind makes its most interesting connections, let it wander to these places. Let it trace the old roads of Ubar across the sand. Let it feel the weight of the stones at Great Zimbabwe, still holding their courses after 700 years without mortar. Let it hear, or imagine it hears, the bells of Rungholt somewhere below the grey water of the Wadden Sea. Let it stand at the edge of the Cambodian jungle, on the LiDAR-mapped ghost of a street that 1 million people walked down 800 years ago, and listen to the silence that is not quite silence, because silence never is. There is always something just below the threshold of what can be heard. always something just beyond the edge of what can be known. The cities are there. We have not finished finding them, and somewhere in the world tonight, probably in many places in the world tonight, someone is one careful excavation, one satellite pass, one well-aimed laser beam away from changing everything we thought we knew about one of them. The world is still full of what has been lost, and what has been lost is still, in ways that matter, waiting to be found. Rest well. The past is patient, and the morning will bring new questions worth asking, which is, when you think about it, one of the more beautiful things about being alive at all. The silence of the empty quarter at night is one of the most complete silences on Earth. In the desert, away from the coast and away from any human settlement, there is no traffic, no aircraft, no distant machinery, no biological chorus of frogs or insects or birds calling in the dark. There is, if there is any wind at all, the sound of sand moving. The sound of sand grains displaced by the movement of air across a dune face is a hiss, very quiet, almost below the threshold of conscious hearing, a sound that you feel more than you hear, a sound that the body registers without the mind quite catching it. If there is no wind, there is nothing. A silence so complete it feels like a texture, like a physical presence rather than an absence. It was in this silence that the caravans moved. Not in the heat of the day, when the temperatures would kill any living creature that could not shelter from them, but in the night and the early morning, in the hours when the sky turned brilliant with stars and the desert cooled to temperatures that a loaded camel could manage. The caravans that moved between Dhofar and the Mediterranean world, along the frankincense routes, travelled under those stars for months at a time. The guides who led them navigated by the stars, the same stars that the astronomers of Merv would later chart, and the same stars that the Polynesian navigators used to cross the Pacific. The stars are a map that every civilization on Earth has learned to read, each in its own way, but the map is the same. The caravan guides of the Rub al-Khali, and the astronomers of the great observatories of the Islamic world, and the navigators of the Polynesian ocean-crossing canoes, were all looking at the same sky and extracting from it the same fundamental information. Where am I? Where am I going? How far have I come? The frankincense that the caravans carried was destined, when it finally reached the Mediterranean, for the altars of Rome and the temples of Egypt and the sanctuaries of the Levant. It would be placed on a burning coal, and it would produce, as it burned, a white smoke with a resinous, warm, slightly woody smell that the ancient world associated with the presence of the divine. The smoke rose. In the theology of most ancient religions, gods or their messengers occupied the upper air, the realm of sky and sun and clouds. Smoke that rose toward them was a form of communication, a visible prayer moving from the earth toward the divine domain. The substance that produced that smoke had to be brought from a very specific place on earth, across a very specific and very difficult geography, by people who had developed over centuries the specialized knowledge and the specialized physical conditioning required to make that journey. The city that sat at the heart of that trade, Ubar or whatever it was really called, was not incidental to the spiritual life of the ancient world. It was, in a very practical and material sense, a necessary component of how the ancient world communicated with its gods. When the city collapsed into its sinkhole, that chain of practical necessity was disrupted. The trade routes adjusted. Other way stations took up the function that Ubar had served. The frankincense continued to flow north, but something was broken that had existed for a very long time. A specific node in a specific network that had taken generations to establish and that could not simply be recreated elsewhere in exactly the same form. The trade adapted, but the city was gone. And the specific human community that had made that particular node work, the families of guides who knew the desert water sources, the merchants who had developed the commercial relationships that made the trade profitable, the craftspeople and innkeepers and religious functionaries who had built their lives around the city's existence, all of those people had to find somewhere else to be. They dispersed into the desert, their knowledge dispersed with them, and the place where all of that knowledge and all of those relationships had been concentrated, descended into the earth, and pulled a layer of sand over itself like a blanket, and the desert moved on. There is a pattern that emerges from looking at these 10 cities together. a pattern that is not immediately obvious when you look at any one of them individually, but becomes clear when you step back and see them as a group. In almost every case, the city's disappearance was preceded by a period of extraordinary success. Ubar sat at the peak of the frankincense trade's importance when the ground beneath it gave way. Tomubamba was one of the most important cities in the Americas when the Inca Civil War destroyed it. Merv was the largest city on Earth within living memory of its destruction. Angkor's hydraulic system was at its most elaborate complexity in the decades before it began to fail. Atlantis, in Plato's account, was at the height of its power and ambition when it was struck down. Rungholt was prosperous and confident when the storm came. Great Zimbabwe's stone walls were at their most impressive when the city was abandoned. Cahokia's mounds were at their most numerous when the population began to decline. Paititi, if it existed, was built precisely to preserve the greatest surviving concentration of Inca wealth and knowledge. And the Nok terracotta tradition was at its most developed, producing its most sophisticated work in the centuries immediately before it ceased. Peak success, it turns out, does not protect against disappearance. In some cases, peak success may actually contribute to it. A city at the height of its power is also a city at the height of its demands on its environment and its resources. It is a city that has maximized its complexity and may have minimized its resilience. It is a city whose very success has made it a target, whether for natural processes that exceed its capacity to manage, or for human forces that covet what it has built. The pattern of success, followed by disappearance, is not a coincidence. It is, in some ways, an expression of a fundamental dynamic of complex systems, the dynamic in which increasing optimization and increasing scale create increasing vulnerability to disruption. The cities that lasted the longest were not always the most impressive. They were the ones that remained, for whatever combination of reasons, within the bounds of what their environments could sustain and what their political systems could manage. This is not a counsel of despair or a warning against ambition. It is simply an observation about the shape of history, an observation that these 10 lost cities make available to us precisely because of what happened to them. The cities that survived, the cities that became Rome or Constantinople or Beijing or Cairo, the cities that have been continuously inhabited for 1,000 or 2,000 years, made their own accommodations with their environments and their geographies, accommodations that were different in each case, but that shared certain structural similarities. They maintained flexibility. They rebuilt after disasters, rather than abandoning. They found ways to renew their populations and their economies when the original basis for those economies shifted. They adapted, in short, while the cities on our list tonight, in their different ways and for their different reasons, could not or did not. But there is a counter-argument to this interpretation that is worth taking seriously, an argument that several of the cities on our list actually make quite forcefully. Merv survived for more than 2,000 years. 2,000 years is an extraordinary span of continuous urban life. The Merv that the Mongols destroyed in 1221 was not the same Merv that the ancient Persians had built on that site in the first millennium BCE. It had been rebuilt, renamed, conquered, rebuilt again, destroyed in lesser catastrophes, rebuilt again. It had been Persian and Greek and Parthian and Sassanid and Islamic, each successive cultural layer building on the ruins of the previous one. The fact that it was eventually destroyed completely does not negate the 2,000 years of successful adaptation that preceded the final catastrophe. 2,000 years is longer than most civilizations manage. The fact that it ended does not mean it failed. It means it ended. The same argument applies, in different ways, to most of the cities on our list. The Nok tradition endured for nearly 2,000 years. The Khmer Empire lasted 5 centuries. Cahokia was a functioning urban center for at least 150 years, which is longer than many modern cities have existed in their current form. These were not brief experiments that failed quickly and left nothing behind. They were sustained human achievements that endured for significant periods of time and left real traces in the world. The fact that they eventually ended, that their final chapter was a disappearance rather than a transformation, does not define everything that came before the ending. It is only the ending that we call a mystery, because it is only the ending that left the record incomplete. The centuries of successful life that preceded the ending are, in most cases, reasonably well documented. They are simply less dramatic, and therefore less memorable, than the disappearance. The relationship between climate and civilization is one that archaeologists and historians have become increasingly focused on in recent decades, partly because of improvements in the paleoclimate record, our ability to reconstruct past climates from sources like tree rings and lake sediment cores and ice cores, and partly because the questions raised by contemporary climate change have made the historical relationship between climate stress and civilizational collapse feel urgently relevant. What the paleoclimate record shows, again and again, when it is matched against the archaeological record of civilizational collapse, is that climate stress is almost never the sole cause of a collapse, but is very frequently a contributing factor, and often the factor that pushes a civilization that is already under stress from other directions over the edge. The drought that preceded the abandonment of Angkor is visible in the tree ring record. The drought that has been linked to the decline of Cahokia is visible in similar proxy records from the Mississippi Valley. The climatic disruption that followed the Thera eruption is visible in the ice core record from Greenland, which shows a spike in sulfur from volcanic aerosols precisely at the right time period. The great storms of the North Sea coast that culminated in the Grote Mandrenki are consistent with a period of climatically unusual storminess that meteorological historians have identified in the medieval period. Climate was present in the story of each of these cities, sometimes as the proximate cause of their end, more often as the background stress that made the other causes more difficult to manage. But the relationship ran in both directions. These cities also shaped their climates in ways both subtle and significant. The vast irrigated farmland around Merv changed the local humidity and the local temperature regime. The deforestation carried out to fuel the cooking fires and construction needs of Angkor and Cahokia altered the hydrology of their surrounding landscapes in ways that made flooding more likely and drought more damaging. The agricultural intensification practiced around Great Zimbabwe may have degraded the soil in ways that reduced its capacity to support the city's population over time. These cities were not passive recipients of climatic conditions. They were active shapers of their local environments, and in each case, the changes they made to that environment contributed, however modestly in each individual instance, to the conditions that eventually made the city unsustainable. This is a dynamic that has been called, in various scholarly contexts, the vulnerability trap, or the success trap, or the complexity trap. The same agricultural intensification and forest clearance and irrigation engineering that allows a city to grow also creates the conditions for the city's eventual decline. The city's success is also the mechanism of its vulnerability, and there is no obvious way out of this trap once a city has entered it, because reducing the agricultural intensification would mean reducing the food supply, and reducing the food supply would mean a smaller population, and a smaller population would mean a less powerful and less defensible city. The choices that create the vulnerability are the same choices that create the city, and the city cannot unmake those choices without unmaking itself. This does not mean that collapse is inevitable for every complex civilization. Some civilizations found ways to navigate this trap, to maintain their agricultural systems over very long periods without degrading the environmental base those systems depended on. Ancient Egypt is the most obvious example, a civilization that maintained complex urban life along the Nile for 3,000 years, partly because the annual flood of the Nile renewed the agricultural land in a way that prevented the soil degradation that afflicted dryland farming civilizations. But Egypt's solution depended on a specific geographic circumstance that most of the cities on our list did not share. They were farming land that did not renew itself automatically. They were depending on irrigation systems that required constant maintenance. They were in landscapes that the act of farming was, over long time periods, degrading, and eventually, in most cases, that degradation caught up with them. The cities that vanished were not failures. They were experiments, very long-running and very impressive experiments in a specific mode of human organization. The experiments ended. The knowledge gained from them, the knowledge that the archaeological record preserves for us to study, is not knowledge about failure. It is knowledge about the conditions under which complex human communities are sustainable and the conditions under which they are not. That knowledge, properly understood, is not depressing. It is useful. It is some of the most important knowledge that the past can offer to the present. Let us return to the people. Because all of this, the geology and the climatology and the trade routes and the hydraulic engineering, all of it is ultimately about people. People who were born into these cities and grew up in them and knew them with the intimate, unreflective knowledge that comes from having walked the same streets every day since childhood. People who had favorite places in their cities, a particular corner of a market where the light fell a certain way in the afternoon, a view from a particular height where you could see the surrounding landscape spread out like a map, a house in a particular neighborhood that smelled of specific plants in the wet season, people who knew which streets to avoid after dark and which taverns had the best food and which section of the city's main ceremonial space was the best vantage point for watching the festivals. People who had absorbed the sounds and smells and textures of their city so completely that they were not aware of absorbing them. The way you are not aware of your own heartbeat. These people had arguments. Not grand historical arguments about the fate of civilizations, but the ordinary arguments of daily life. Arguments about prices and debts and inheritances and boundaries. Arguments about whose responsibility it was to repair a section of shared wall. Arguments about the noise from a neighbor's house that kept the children awake. Arguments in the market about the quality of a piece of cloth, about whether the grain in a sack was as good as the grain on the top of the sack. Arguments between parents and children about choices and responsibilities. Arguments between lovers about the future and what it should look like. These arguments happened in every city on our list, in whatever languages those cities spoke, with whatever emotional registers those cultures permitted, and whatever conflict resolution mechanisms those societies had developed. They happened every day, in the way that arguments happen in every city on Earth every day, because conflict is the price of proximity, and proximity is the price of civilization. And they had festivals. Every city on our list had festivals. We know this with certainty, because every human society has festivals, and we can sometimes glimpse the specific shape of particular festivals in the archaeological record. The bas-relief carvings at Angkor show festivals, processions, and celebrations, depicted with the care that suggests these were important events in the life of the community, events worth commemorating in stone. The Islamic sources that describe Merv before the Mongols came mention the Great Friday prayers at the mosques, the celebrations of the religious calendar, the gatherings of scholars that were a kind of intellectual festival in their own right. The burial evidence at Cahokia suggests elaborate ceremonies, events that brought people together from across the community and perhaps from the satellite settlements in the surrounding landscape. The Nok terracottas, with their elaborate headdresses and ceremonial ornaments, are depicting people dressed for occasions that mattered. Everyone in those figures has somewhere important to go. The festivals were the moments when the city knew itself, when the dispersed population of a large settlement, people who might go days without encountering each other in the ordinary course of their lives, in different neighborhoods and different occupational niches, came together in a shared space for a shared purpose and experienced themselves as a community. The great plazas of Cahokia, the main ceremonial spaces of Angkor, the forum of every city in the classical world, the great open spaces at the center of Islamic cities, all of these served this function. They were the places where the city gathered to be the city, where it reminded itself of what it was, what it believed, who it belonged to, and what it owed to the powers, human and divine, that governed its existence. When the festivals stopped, the city was already dying, at least as a community of shared consciousness. The physical structures might persist for a while. People might still live in them out of inertia or because they had nowhere else to go. But the city as a collective experience, as a shared project that its inhabitants were invested in and committed to, ended when the gathering in the plaza stopped, when the drums fell silent, when the fire at the center of the ceremony was not lit. because there was no one to light it for. That moment of silence, that moment when the communal fire went out for the last time, and no one knew to mourn it, because there was no longer a community to mourn it together. That moment is the one we cannot find in the archaeological record. We can find the ashes of old fires. We can find the remnants of old gatherings. But we cannot find the last gathering. Cannot find the moment when the gathering became a habit, and then an obligation, and then a memory, and then nothing at all. This is the loss at the heart of all these lost cities. Not the buildings, not even the people. The thing that is most irretrievably lost is the shared experience, the collective knowledge that a city is a community, and that a community is a thing worth protecting and sustaining. When that knowledge failed, when the people of these cities lost the will or the capacity to keep the collective project going, the city was already over, even if the walls were still standing. To understand what it means that Merv was once the largest city on Earth, you have to try to hold two facts in your mind simultaneously. The first fact is the sheer scale of the human enterprise that was Merv at its peak. 1 million people, a city whose edges, when you walked them at a comfortable pace, would take most of a day to circumnavigate. Streets that went on for kilometers, lined with buildings that rose several stories, filled with the sounds and smells and clamor of a vast population going about its business. Markets that handled goods from every corner of the known world. Schools where hundreds of students studied medicine and mathematics and astronomy under scholars whose reputations extended across the Islamic world. Libraries whose catalogues would have required weeks to read through. Bathhouses that could accommodate hundreds of people at a time. Caravanserais where merchants and their animals could shelter after weeks of travel and recover their strength before continuing. Mosques where thousands of people gathered on Friday and whose minarets rose above the city's roofline like slender stone fingers reaching toward the sky. All of that, 1 million human lives worth of daily activity, happening every day in this one place. The noise of it would have been extraordinary. A continuous low roar of human voices and animal sounds, and the percussion of craft workshops, and the calls of vendors, and the creaking of wagon wheels, and the splashing of water in the canal system that distributed the Murghab. Rivers flow through the city in dozens of channels. The smell would have been complex, and not always pleasant, as the smells of cities always are. The smell of food cooking and animals and people and industry and waste management, and the particular smell of mud brick in the heat of the sun. The feel of it would have been the feel of being in the middle of something enormous, something that extended in every direction beyond the range of vision, something that had its own momentum and its own gravity that pulled people toward it from hundreds of miles away. The second fact you have to hold simultaneously is what happened next. In a week, in 7 days of Mongol violence, all of that was gone. Not reduced, not damaged, gone. The city that had taken more than 2,000 years to build, that had accumulated its complexity and its wealth and its cultural richness over hundreds of generations of human effort, was eliminated in a week. The people who had sustained it were killed. The physical infrastructure was destroyed. The intellectual tradition it had hosted was scattered and burned. The commercial relationships it had organized were severed. The water system that had made it possible in the first place was deliberately demolished. And then, after the week of destruction, the Mongols moved on. They had other cities to destroy. Merv was behind them. The desert, which had been waiting patiently throughout the 2,000-year experiment of this city, began to move back in. The contrast between the 2,000 years and the 1 week is almost impossible to hold in the mind in a way that feels real. 2,000 years of human effort building and maintaining and extending a great city, creating a place where human beings could live well and think freely and make things of beauty and conduct the business of civilization at the highest level that their moment in history permitted. 1 week in which all of that was dismantled and discarded by people for whom the accumulated wealth and the accumulated knowledge were simply obstacles to their military and political objectives. The asymmetry is so extreme that it strains credibility. And yet, it is true. This is what happened. The libraries of Merv burned. The scholars of Merv were killed. The canals of Merv were filled with rubble. And the largest city on Earth became a field of ruins in a week. History is full of these asymmetries. It is almost always faster to destroy than to build. The capacity for destruction that organized violence brings to bear on human settlements is not matched by any equivalent capacity for rapid creation. A cathedral that took a century to build can be knocked down in an afternoon. A library that took a generation to assemble can burn in hours. A water system that took a civilization to design and build can be dismantled in days. This asymmetry is not a discovery of the modern world or of any particular historical period. It is a fundamental feature of the physical reality in which human beings build things, and the cities on our list tonight are, in their different ways, illustrations of this fundamental asymmetry. The building took centuries, the ending took less. But here is the counterweight to that bleakness, the fact that softens the harshness of the asymmetry without denying it. The records survive. Not all of them, not most of them, but some. Enough to have a conversation about, enough to understand that Merv was great, and that its library contained wonders, and that its scholars advanced human knowledge in ways that affected the entire subsequent development of Islamic, and through Islamic, European, mathematics, and astronomy, and medicine. The records survive because people cared enough to make them, because the impulse to document and transmit is as fundamental to human civilization as the impulse to build. The Mongols destroyed the libraries of Merv, but they could not destroy all the scholarship that had passed through Merv, all the students who had studied there and carried what they had learned with them to other cities, all the copies of manuscripts that existed elsewhere, all the influence that the intellectual tradition of Central Asia had already had on the wider world before the destruction came. Knowledge, it turns out, is harder to destroy than buildings. Not impossible, but harder. Scholars who are killed cannot teach new students, and knowledge that exists only in the minds of killed scholars dies with them. But knowledge that has been transmitted, that has been copied into manuscripts that exist in multiple locations, that has been absorbed into the training of students who have scattered to other cities, that knowledge persists in a distributed, resilient form that is much harder to eliminate than a single library in a single city. The Mongols destroyed Merv's libraries. They could not destroy the civilization of learning that had produced and inhabited those libraries, because that civilization extended far beyond Merv's walls. Its roots were in Merv, and those roots were torn up. But the branches were elsewhere, and from the branches, in the centuries after the destruction, new roots grew. The question of what we owe to lost cities, the question of what obligation the living have toward the dead places of the world, is one that does not have a simple or universally accepted answer. There are those who argue that the past is the past, that cities that have been lost and people who have died are not our responsibility, that the resources devoted to archaeology and historical research would be better spent on the needs of the present. This is not an unreasonable position. The needs of the present are real and pressing, and the resources available to address them are finite. But there is a counter-argument that seems to me more compelling. The past is not separate from the present in the way that this position implies. The past is the ground on which the present stands, the accumulation of choices and circumstances and contingencies that produce the world as it currently is. Understanding the past is not a luxury or a hobby. It is the way we understand the conditions of our own existence, the way we identify the patterns that recur in human history, the way we learn from the accumulated experience of the species. What kinds of human organization are sustainable, and what kinds are not? The study of lost cities is, in this sense, directly relevant to the question of how to build cities that do not become lost. The lessons from Merv about the fragility of water systems in arid environments. The lessons from Angkor about the vulnerability of hydraulic systems to climate stress. The lessons from Cahokia about the limits of agricultural intensification. The lessons from Rungholt about the capacity of the sea to overwhelm even well-maintained coastal defenses. These are not abstract historical curiosities. They are directly relevant to the challenges that contemporary civilizations face in managing their own water systems and their own agricultural systems and their own coastal infrastructure under conditions of climate change. The past has done us the favor of running these experiments, of testing these approaches to civilizational organization over the long term and recording, in the archaeological evidence it left behind, how they performed. We are poor stewards of our own future if we ignore that record. We owe the lost cities our attention, not because of sentimentality about the dead, though there is nothing wrong with sentiment about those who built remarkable things and then lost them, but because they paid, with their civilizational lives, for knowledge that we need. The least we can do is learn what they have to teach. And so at the end of this long journey, through the lost and the hidden, and the submerged, and the buried, and the vanished, we come back to where we started, to the simple, profound, disorienting fact that cities disappear. That the most permanent seeming things that human beings build, the thick walls and the deep foundations and the great temples and the elaborate water systems and the accumulated cultural wealth of centuries, are not permanent at all. That the world has swallowed cities whole, has buried them under sand and mud and forest and subsequent cities, has drowned them in rising waters and shaken them to pieces in earthquakes and burned them to ash in wars, and allowed them to be slowly unmade by the patient work of neglect and plant roots and weather, that the cities we live in now are not immune to any of these processes, that the assumptions we make about the permanence of the built world are the same assumptions that the people of Merv made, and the people of Rungholt, and the people of Cahokia, and all the other people of all the other cities that are now archaeological sites or memories or legends or simply silence. This is not meant to induce despair. The cities that disappeared were real for as long as they lasted. The lives lived in them were real lives, full of the full range of human experience, joy and grief and boredom and love, and the satisfaction of work done well, and the frustration of work that went wrong, and the long, quiet, ordinary days that make up most of any life. The fact that the city is gone does not retroactively unlive those lives. They happened. They were as real as your life is real, and the disappearance of the city they happened in does not diminish them. But the disappearance of the city does mean that those lives are not remembered in the way that the lives of people in cities that survived are remembered. The ordinary people of Merv, the women who cooked the meals, and the men who mended the roofs, and the children who ran through the streets, and the old people who sat in the sun and watched the city go by, they are not remembered by name. They left no trace in the historical record except the aggregate trace of their presence, the fact that there was a city here, and it was large, and it was full of people. The individual lives are lost, merged into the anonymity of the archaeological site. They are known only as a collective, as the people who were here, not as the specific individuals they were. This is the deepest loss. Not the buildings, not the wealth, not even the knowledge. The deepest loss is the individual human beings, the specific people with their specific faces and their specific voices and their specific way of moving through the world, who lived in these playovers and whose individual existence has been completely erased by the passage of time and the disappearance of the community that might have remembered them. We remember Genghis Khan. We do not remember the potter in Merv, who was killed the week his city was destroyed, whose name we will never know, whose face we will never see, whose specific contribution to the life of his city, whatever it was, is entirely unknown. He was as real as Genghis Khan. His life was as real and as specific and as complete as Genghis Khan's life. And he is entirely gone, while Genghis Khan is remembered everywhere. History remembers the destroyers and forgets the builders, the architects and engineers and merchants and scholars and farmers and craftspeople who built Merv and Angkor and Cahokia, and the rest are nameless. The people who destroyed them, when they can be identified, are remembered. This is an injustice of historical record-keeping so complete and so ancient that it feels almost like a law of nature, but it is not. It is a contingent feature of the kinds of records that have survived from the past, and it is worth being aware of, and worth thinking about, and worth trying, in a modest way, to correct. The people who built these cities deserve to be remembered, as well as the people who destroyed them. The builders of Merv deserve a place in our consciousness, alongside Tolui, who destroyed it. The architects of Cahokia's earthworks deserve a place alongside the unknown stresses that brought the city down. The potters and sculptors of the Nok tradition deserve a place alongside the historical mystery of their disappearance. We cannot give them their names back. We cannot give them their individual faces back. What we can do is acknowledge them, and acknowledge the magnitude of what they built and feel. Across the distance of centuries and millennia, the weight of their collective presence in the places where they lived. The cities are gone, the people are gone, but the fact of their existence is not gone. It is in the earth, waiting for us to find it, patient as stone, patient as sand, patient as the cold grey water of the Wadden Sea at low tide, exposing for a few hours what it has kept for centuries. The fact of their existence waits for us, and the least we can do, the very least, is pay attention. There is a story told among the scholars who study ancient Central Asia about a man who lived in Merv in the years before the Mongols came. His name was Yakut al-Hamawi, and he was not a native of Merv, but a traveller, a Syrian-born geographer and lexicographer who had spent years wandering the Islamic world, collecting information for a great geographical encyclopedia he was writing. He arrived in Merv sometime around 1215 CE, 6 years before the Mongols, and he spent several years there, working in its libraries. He wrote about those libraries with a joy that is unmistakable, even in translation. He described how he would lose himself in the stacks for entire days, how he would begin looking for one thing and find himself, hours later, still reading, having followed a thread from one manuscript to another in the way that a person who loves books always does, pulled along by interest and surprise, and the particular pleasure of discovering that two things you thought were unconnected are connected in ways you had not anticipated. He wrote about the generosity of the scholars who ran the libraries, who lent him books he needed and directed him to sources he had not known existed. He wrote about the quality of the scholarship he encountered in Merv, the rigour and the breadth and the originality of the intellectual work being done there. He was clearly happy in Merv in a way that was specific to that city and that time, happy with the sense of being surrounded by knowledge and by people who valued it. And then the Mongols came. Yakut was not in Merv when they arrived. He had moved on by 1221. He survived, but he never forgot what he had found in the libraries of Merv, and in his encyclopedia, the Mujam al-Buldan, the Dictionary of Countries. His entry for Merv is one of the longest and most detailed in the book. He wrote about it as a place of extraordinary cultural richness, a place that deserved to be remembered. He did not know when he wrote that entry that Merv had already been destroyed. The news travelled slowly in the medieval world. By the time Yakut learned what had happened to the city and to the libraries he had loved, the city had already been gone for years. What Yakut felt when he learned what had happened to Merv, we can only imagine. He had been there. He had sat in those libraries. He had met the scholars who ran them. He knew, in the specific, particular way that comes from personal experience, what had been destroyed. Not in the abstract, in the concrete. This specific building, on this specific street, where this specific man had been cataloguing this specific manuscript on the day Yakut came in to look for something else. That was gone. The man was dead. The manuscript was ash. The building was rubble. And Yakut, who was alive and travelling the roads of the Islamic world with his notes and his drafts and the accumulated knowledge of years of wandering, was one of the last people on earth who could say, from personal experience, what had been there, what it had felt like to be inside it, what it had smelled like, in the way that libraries have a specific smell that you know immediately and that triggers, for people who love libraries, an immediate emotional response. He could say what the light was like through the library windows in the afternoon, and what the sound was like of a scholar dictating to a student in one corner, while another scholar argued with a third in a different corner. He knew these things, and after a while, he was one of the last people alive who knew them. When Yakut died, around 1229 CE, that specific, embodied knowledge of Merv's libraries died with him. What remained was what he had written, the Mujam al-Buldan, with its loving entry for Merv and its catalogue of what that city had been and meant, which is itself a form of preservation, not the same as the libraries themselves. But not nothing. There is a man mentioned in the oral traditions of several communities living in the cloud forest region of southeastern Peru, a man who appears in different versions of the story with different names, but always with the same essential characteristic. He is a keeper. He is someone whose responsibility it is to remember where things are. Not just physical things, buildings and caches of gold and storehouses of corn, but also the things that cannot be touched, the sequences of ceremony and the words of chant, and the astronomical knowledge that tells the agricultural calendar when to plant and when to harvest and when to expect rain. He carries these things in his memory. He does not write them down, because the writing system of the Inca was quipus, the knotted cord records that encoded numerical information, but could not, in the form we understand them, encode narrative or ceremonial knowledge. He carries the ceremonial knowledge in his body, in the patterns of movement and breath and sound that enact the ceremonies and keep them alive, and he passes this knowledge to a successor. He teaches a younger person, slowly and over many years, the full repertoire of what he carries. The teaching is not done quickly or casually. It is done with great care, in the specific order in which the knowledge must be held, because the order is part of the knowledge, because certain things cannot be understood until other things have been understood first, because the knowledge is not a list of facts, but a structure, a building in which the rooms must be visited in a certain sequence, or they do not make sense. He teaches this younger person the way his teacher taught him, and that teacher's teacher before that, back through the generations to the people who built the city and organized the knowledge in the first place. This chain of transmission, if it has continued unbroken for 500 years, means that somewhere in the cloud forest regions of South America today, there are people who carry knowledge about Paititi, or about what Paititi actually was, that has never been shared with the outside world, not because of secrecy for its own sake, but because the knowledge belongs to a community, and sharing it with outsiders has not been part of the tradition of how it is held. The communities that hold it have survived 5 centuries of colonialism and displacement and cultural pressure and the loss of so much else, and they have held this particular knowledge through all of that because it matters to them in ways that are not about archaeological tourism or historical scholarship. It matters because it connects them to who they were before the conquest and who they still are. Whether any such chain of transmission has survived completely intact, whether there is truly still a keeper of this specific knowledge still practicing in the cloud forests, is something that no outsider can say with confidence. What can be said is that indigenous communities in this region have maintained cultural traditions of extraordinary resilience through circumstances that would have destroyed less rooted communities, and that the idea of such a keeper is not implausible given what we know about the strength of those traditions. The knowledge may be there. We simply may not be the right people to receive it. The mounds of Cahokia stand today in a public park called Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site, just east of the Mississippi River in Illinois, and on most days you can walk among them with a kind of freedom that is unusual for a site of this significance. There are interpretive signs. There is a visitor center with exhibits explaining what the site is and when it was occupied and what the current state of archaeological understanding is. And then there are the mounds themselves, rising from the flat Illinois floodplain, covered in grass, standing in the particular silence that old earthworks have, a silence that is different from the silence of stone ruins, because the mounds are alive, green with growing things, participating in the biological present in a way that stone refuses to do. Monk's Mound, the great central platform, is accessible by a paved path. You can climb it, and when you stand at the top, you can see why this place was chosen, why the people who built Cahokia chose this specific flat plain at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers as the place to build the largest city north of Mexico. The view from the top of Monk's Mound is extraordinary, not because of any scenic grandeur. The Illinois plain is not scenically dramatic in the way of mountains or coasts or great canyons, but because of the sheer extent of it. In every direction, the land is flat and wide. The rivers are visible in the middle distance. The sky is enormous in the way that flat country skies always are. And you can feel, standing there, the reason why someone looked at this place and said, here is where we build. They built here because the land was rich and the rivers were highways, and the location allowed access to the entire eastern drainage of the continent. They built here because the geographical position gave them control over trade routes that extended in every direction. They built here because there was enough food, potentially to sustain a very large population if the agricultural system could be made to work at sufficient scale. They built here because someone had the vision to see what this place could become, and the authority to organize the labor required to make the vision real, and the charisma, or the power to hold the community together through the decades it would take to build the city to its full scale. They built here because that person, or those people, succeeded in selling the vision to enough other people that the collective project got underway and developed its own momentum. That vision, that success, that momentum are invisible to us now. We can see the mounds it produced. We cannot see the faces of the people who built them, cannot hear the arguments and the negotiations and the appeals to shared purpose that assembled a workforce large enough to move the earth for 100 mounds over the course of a century. We cannot see the pride that must have been felt by the community as the great central mound rose higher than anything else in the flat landscape, visible from distances that would have made it a landmark for travelers approaching from every direction. A built feature of the landscape so large that it redefined the landscape and announced to anyone who saw it that something significant was happening here, something that deserved to be noticed and respected and perhaps slightly feared. The mounds are still there. 37 of the original 100+ survive in reasonably intact condition. The rest were ploughed under in the agricultural expansion of the 19th and 20th centuries, flattened to make room for fields and then suburbs and then highways. The ones that survive are protected now, at least in theory, though the pressures on the site from the urban growth of the St. Louis metropolitan area are real and ongoing. You can visit them, you can climb them, you can stand at the top of Monk's Mound and look out over the flat land and try to imagine the city that was there, the noise and the smell and the movement of a population of tens of thousands going about their daily lives in the space that is now quiet grass and interpretive signs. It is worth trying. The imagining is incomplete, inevitably, because the imagination works from what it knows, and what it knows is insufficient, but the attempt itself is valuable. The act of standing in a place and consciously trying to populate it with the people who were once there, to bring them back not as ghosts or as historical abstractions, but as real human beings with real lives, is a form of respect that the dead places of the world deserve from the living. It is not much, but it is something. There is a specific time of year in what was once Nok territory, in the central Nigerian plateau, when the Harmattan wind blows from the Sahara and covers everything with a fine reddish dust that settles on every surface and filters the sunlight so that the whole landscape seems to glow with an amber warmth that is very beautiful and very dry. The laterite soil of the region, which is naturally reddish-orange in colour, turns the same shade as the Harmattan dust, so that the earth and the sky seem to be made of the same material during this season, a reddish-brown universe of dust and light. It was in this red earth that the Nok terracottas were fired. The clay from which they were made was local, drawn from the same laterite formations that underlie the entire plateau. The figures, when you see them in photographs or in museum cases, have that reddish-orange colour that is both the colour of the material and the colour of the landscape from which the material came. They look like the earth that made them. They look, in some hard-to-articulate way, like they belong to the plateau, like they grew from it the way the dry season grasses grow from it, rooted in something specific and irreplaceable. The people who made them were also rooted in that specific landscape. They knew the clay. They knew where to find it and how to prepare it. They knew how to build the kilns, the structures of termite mound material and clay that could reach the temperatures needed to fire the terracotta without cracking it. They knew the timing, the rhythm of the firing process, when to feed the fire and when to let it settle, and when to open the kiln, and when the figures were ready to be removed. They knew all of this, the way that craftspeople who have grown up in a tradition know things, in their hands as much as in their heads, in the body's memory of repetition, as much as in the conscious mind's storage of information. That embodied knowledge is the most fragile kind. It survives only through practice, only through the unbroken chain of demonstration and repetition by which a master passes a skill to an apprentice, who becomes a master who passes it to an apprentice. When the chain is broken, even for a generation, the knowledge begins to fade. When it is broken for multiple generations, it becomes very difficult to reconstruct from first principles, because embodied knowledge is not fully articulate, cannot be fully written down, contains irreducible elements of touch and feel, and timing that language struggles to encode. The terracotta tradition of Nok was maintained for nearly 2,000 years by exactly this kind of embodied knowledge, passed hand to hand across more than 60 generations of craftspeople, and then it stopped. The chain was broken, not by a single catastrophe, as far as we can tell, but by whatever process of cultural transformation ended the distinctive Nok tradition and produced the different-looking subsequent cultures of the region. The potters of the central Nigerian plateau today are skilled. They are working in long-established local traditions. They are not working in the Nok tradition, because the Nok tradition is not there to be worked in anymore. It is not accessible. It is not recoverable. It ended, and the embodied knowledge that was its core ended with the practice, and what remains is only the objects, only the fired clay that the tradition produced, sitting in museums and in the hands of collectors, beautiful and silent, and entirely unaware that the chain of hands that made them possible, the 60-generation-long chain of demonstration and practice and correction and refinement, is broken and cannot be unbroken. The Nok terracottas are among the most moving objects in the world, for those who know what they are. They are not moving because they are beautiful, though they are. They are moving because they are the last word of a conversation that lasted 2,000 years, and then stopped, because the speakers fell silent, and no one came to continue it. The figures look out from behind their hollow eyes, with an expression that is hard to read, not because the expression is ambiguous, but because we do not have the cultural key that would let us decode what a Nok expression meant. They are expressing something. We cannot be sure what. And the people who could have told us have been gone for 1,700 years. So we come, at last, to what connects all these places. We have travelled to the desert of Arabia, and to the mountains of Ecuador, and to the plains of Central Asia, and to the jungles of Cambodia, and to the coasts of the North Sea, and to the plateaus of sub-Saharan Africa, and to the river bottoms of the American Midwest, and to the cloud forests of South America, and to the highlands of West Africa. We have followed old roads through sand and silt and forest and mud. We have tried to hear, in the silences of archaeological sites, the sounds of the cities that were once there. What connects these places is not their geography, or their era, or the nature of their disappearance. What connects them is that they were all human experiments, in the most fundamental kind of experiment that human beings run. The experiment of living together, of building something collectively that none of them could build alone, of organizing the combined effort of thousands of people towards shared goals. They all tried this. They all succeeded for a while, some of them for a remarkably long while, and they all, eventually, stopped. The experiments ended. The results were left in the ground, and now we sit, thousands of years later in some cases, reading those results, trying to extract from the stones and the pottery shards, and the sediment layers, and the satellite imagery, and the oral traditions, and the fragmentary written records, the understanding of what those experiments were trying to do, and why they ended the way they did. This is scholarship. This is archaeology. This is history. But it is also, at a deeper level, a form of conversation with the dead. A conversation in which we ask questions that they cannot directly answer, and in which we try to reconstruct from what they left behind the answers they would have given if they could. The cities vanished. But the conversation continues, and as long as it continues, they have not entirely vanished. They are here, in the question of what they were and what happened to them, in the effort to understand and to remember, in the attention that we bring to the ground where they stood. Rest well tonight. Somewhere beneath the world you are sleeping in, there are cities waiting to be found. And the people who built them, the real human beings, who mixed the mortar and laid the stone and drew the water and cooked the food and raised the children and argued about the price of grain and fell asleep to the sounds of their city at night, they were here. They were as real as you are. And the fact that they are gone and that we are still here does not mean we have forgotten them. It means we have not stopped looking. Consider the specific texture of darkness in a pre-modern city. There was no electric light, no sodium vapor glow on the underside of clouds, no ambient illumination from the screens and signs and street lamps that mean that even the darkest night in any modern city is never truly dark. In the cities we have been discussing tonight, when the oil lamps went out and the fires in the hearths burned down to embers and the moon was hidden by cloud, the darkness was complete. You could not see your hand in front of your face. You navigated by memory, by the feel of familiar walls and the sound of familiar footsteps and the smell of familiar places, by all the accumulated sensory knowledge of a person who has lived in the same city all their life and knows it the way they know their own body. The city at night was a different city from the city in the day. The streets that were crowded and noisy in the daylight hours were empty and silent in the small hours. The sounds that the day suppressed, the calls of night birds, the drip of water from a roof, the creak of wood contracting in the cooler air, the distant sound of water moving in a canal, these came forward in the dark and filled the acoustic space that the daytime sounds had occupied. The city breathed differently at night. The people who had been moving through it all day were still, their bodies doing the work of sleep and repair, their minds somewhere in the landscape of dreams, and the city itself rested in the particular way that cities rest, incompletely, always with some part of it still active, some watchman still awake, some night worker still at their task, some worried parent still listening to a feverish child. This quality of night, this specific texture of dark and quiet, and the particular sounds of a sleeping city, is something that the archaeology cannot recover. We can reconstruct the layout of streets, we can estimate the density of buildings, we can calculate, roughly, how many people might have been sleeping in a given block on a given night. But we cannot recover the sound of those streets in the deep, dark hours, the quality of the silence that lay over them, the specific kind of quiet that tells you this is a city sleeping and not a city dead. That specific quiet was real. Every night, in Merv and in Angkor and in Cahokia and in Rungholt and in all the others, that quiet settled over those streets and was broken only by the ordinary sounds of night and by whatever human activity could not wait for morning. And then the light came back, the way it always did, the way it will tomorrow morning in whatever city or town or countryside you find yourself in, and the city woke again and the sounds came back and the day began. Until the day that the day did not begin again, until the morning that the city woke to something that was not the ordinary resumption of ordinary life, but was instead the end of something. Maybe a catastrophic morning, a morning of fire or flood or armies at the gate. Maybe a gradual morning, one in a series of mornings that was slightly less lively than the one before. One fewer family in the market, one fewer smoke rising from the roofline, the slow exhalation of a community that is becoming less. Either way, there was a last morning. A morning that was the last time that particular arrangement of people and streets and sounds and smells constituted a city and not a ruin. And no one living through that morning knew it was the last one. They woke, as people always wake, with whatever mixture of anticipation and reluctance greets the return of consciousness. And they began the day without knowing they were ending it. This is the quality of historical tragedy that is hardest to hold and perhaps most worth holding. Not the grand sweep of civilizational rise and fall, not the statistics and the archaeology and the paleoclimate data, but the specific ordinary morning that turned out to be the last one, experienced by specific ordinary people who had no idea that it was. History is full of last days that were lived without knowledge of being last days. The people of Rungholt went to bed on the night of the 15th of January, the 1362, with no particular reason to believe that the morning would not be like other mornings. The scholars of Merv rose on some morning in 1221 with their usual intentions to read and write and teach, not yet knowing that the Mongols had already reached the edge of the oasis. The people of Cahokia went about the business of a community in slow decline, each person managing their own shrinking situation, without any collective understanding that the city as a whole was in its last decades. They lived the last day without knowing it was the last day, and the tragedy of that is not diminished by the fact that it was a long time ago. The distance of time does not make the experience of those people less real. It only makes it inaccessible to us. They were there. They felt what it is like to be alive on the last day of something that has been there for longer than anyone can remember. And we are here, looking back at the traces they left, trying to understand what happened, trying to feel across the distance of centuries something of what it must have been like to be in those places at those moments. The effort is imperfect. The understanding is incomplete. But the trying matters. The sky above the lost cities is the same sky that is above us now. This is a fact worth sitting with in the slow hours of the night. The stars that the caravan guides of the Rub al-Khali used to navigate the frankincense routes are the same stars that are visible from wherever you are tonight, if the clouds permit. The Pleiades that the ancient Mesopotamians used as an agricultural calendar marker are the same Pleiades that rise and set in our sky. The moon that cast its light on the streets of Merv and the stones of Great Zimbabwe and the earthen platforms of Cahokia casts its light now on whatever landscape you are sleeping in. The sky is the one thing that the lost cities still share with us, without mediation, without interpretation, without the filter of archaeology and reconstruction. When you step outside on a clear night and look up, you are looking at what the people of these cities looked at. The light from those same stars has been traveling toward us for years and centuries and millennia, and it was falling on those cities too, on the flat rooftops where people slept in the hot seasons, and on the great towers and minarets that rose above the roofline, and on the faces of the people who stepped outside in the small hours and looked up, as people have always looked up, at the vast and inexplicable beauty of the dark sky filled with light. They wondered what the stars were. Every civilization on our list had an astronomy, a set of ideas and practices organized around the observation and interpretation of the sky. The astronomers of Merv's great observatories were among the most sophisticated scientists of the medieval world, using instruments of considerable precision to track the movements of the planets and refine the mathematical models that described those movements. The astronomical alignments built into Cahokia's woodhenge circles, the circles of large cedar posts whose shadows would have marked the equinoxes and solstices with considerable precision, suggest a community that paid careful attention to the sky's seasonal rhythm and built that attention into the fabric of their city. The Inca who built Tomabamba oriented their great temple to the sun in ways that connected the building to the astronomical calendar. The people of the Nok culture depicted the sky in their art, incorporated astronomical references into their ceremonial objects, lived in the same relationship to the turning of the year that all agricultural communities live in, attentive to the moments when the sun or the moon or the stars told them what the earth needed and what the earth was about to do. The sky was the clock and the calendar and the compass, and for many of these civilizations, the home of the gods and the ancestors and all the powers that governed the world. It was the most public thing there was, available to everyone, requiring no special access or special knowledge to observe in its basic rhythms. The first day of spring, when the sun rose in a certain position and the days became reliably longer than the nights, was visible to every person who opened their eyes in the morning. The full moon was visible to everyone, the particular brightness of Venus in the evening sky, the Milky Way on a moonless night, the sudden flare of a meteor. All of these were shared experiences that the whole community had simultaneously, experiences that crossed every boundary of wealth and status and occupation and neighborhood, and connected the people of the city, briefly and without effort, in the shared experience of looking at the same sky. When we look at the same sky tonight, something of that connection persists, not between us and the people of those cities who are gone, but between us and the fact that people were there, that people stood in those places and looked at this same sky with these same eyes and felt in their looking something of what we feel in ours. The wonder at the scale of it, the comfort of familiarity, the same stars in roughly the same positions that their parents had shown them, the intimation, faint and slightly uncomfortable, that the sky's vastness puts the city and everything in it, including the observer, in a perspective that is not entirely reassuring. The city is large and important, and the center of the world as far as its inhabitants are concerned. The sky does not agree. The sky is indifferent to the city in the specific, comprehensive, non-hostile way that everything much larger than a human being is indifferent to human concerns. And the people who stood in those cities and looked up at the sky knew this, felt this, and returned inside to their ordinary lives, carrying the knowledge with them, the way you carry something too large to put down. Sleep now, if sleep is near. The cities are in the earth, the stars are in the sky. Both will be there when you wake, patient and complete, and entirely indifferent to whether you notice them or not. The noticing is yours, the caring is yours, and the caring is enough. The caring is everything.